Look closely at this image, a dark, grainy photograph of a massive human skull, lying half buried in the earth beside a femur bone, longer than a man is tall. You've probably seen pictures like this before, shared across the internet, featured in old newspapers, or even hinted at in ancient texts. They spark an immediate, almost primal question in our minds. What if the stories are true? What if giants once walked the earth? From the biblical Nephilim to the towering figures of Native American lore, nearly every culture on the planet carries legends of a forgotten race of giants. These aren't just casual campfire tales, they are deeply embedded in our collective history, suggesting something profound and unsettling about our past. Today, we're going to dig deep beyond the myths and the sensational headlines to uncover the actual evidence, the scientific explanations, and the strange, enduring mystery of ancient giant human skeletons. Think for a moment about the sheer power of these stories. They capture our imagination because they challenge everything we think we know about human history. They whisper of a time when the world was wilder, stranger, and populated by beings of immense power and stature. We find reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries, sober accounts from reputable archaeologists and newspapers, detailing the discovery of skeletons measuring 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. These weren't just isolated finds, they were reported from the mounds of Ohio to the valleys of the Caucasus, from ancient Sardinia to remote islands in the Pacific. So what happened to all that evidence? Why does mainstream science so often dismiss these claims as hoaxes or misidentifications? We're about to embark on a journey to separate fact from fiction, to sift through the sands of time and scrutiny, and to answer the burning question: is there any truth to the legends, or have we been chasing shadows all along? This investigation is more than just a look at old bones. It's a journey into the very heart of how history is made, unmade, and sometimes hidden from view. We'll explore compelling archaeological finds that defy easy explanation. We'll analyze the fascinating role of sensationalist media, from the penny presses of the 1800s to the viral clickbait of the digital age, in shaping this enduring narrative. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most incredible stories are born from a complex mixture of genuine discovery, human error, and outright deception. By the end of this video, you will have a clear-eyed view of one of history's most captivating enigmas. You'll understand not only what the evidence really says, but also why the idea of ancient giants continues to hold such a powerful grip on the human psyche. The truth is often stranger than fiction, and the story of the giants is one of the strangest of all. Let's begin. To understand the modern fascination with giant skeletons, we must first travel back to the very dawn of human storytelling, long before any archaeological digs or newspaper headlines. The concept of giants is a foundational element in the mythologies of cultures across the globe, suggesting a shared primal memory or a universal human fascination with beings of immense scale and power. One of the most influential and enduring accounts comes from the Hebrew Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, which speaks of the Nephilim. These enigmatic figures are described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and are explicitly called the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. This passage has been interpreted for centuries as a record of a literal race of giants who inhabited the earth before the Great Flood, setting a powerful theological and historical precedent that would echo through Western thought. This biblical narrative was later expanded upon in other ancient texts, like the apocryphal Book of Enoch, which offers even more vivid descriptions of their gigantic stature and destructive nature. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks wove their own elaborate tales of giants and titans. The Titans were the primordial deities of immense size and strength who ruled during the legendary Golden Age preceding the Olympian gods. Their conflict, the Titanomachy, was a world-shattering war for control of the cosmos. Later, the Giants, born from the blood of the castrated Uranus, waged war on Olympus itself, a story famously depicted on the Great Altar of Pergamon. These were not just big people, they were elemental forces personified, representing the raw, untamed power of the earth and the chaotic past that civilization had to overcome. This theme of giants as symbolic of a wild, earlier age is remarkably consistent. In Norse mythology, the Jötnar, often translated as giants, are frequently in conflict with the Aesir gods. Figures like the frost giant Ymir, from whose body the world was created, and the mighty Skrymir, who Thor mistakenly believes is a range of mountains, underscore a worldview where the boundaries between the natural world, the supernatural, and sheer physical scale were beautifully and terrifyingly blurred. Moving to the Americas, we find that indigenous traditions are equally rich with accounts of giant beings. Numerous tribes, from the Cherokee in the southeast to the Paiute in the Great Basin, have oral histories that speak of a race of aggressive, often cannibalistic, giants that their ancestors had to defeat or drive away. For instance, the Paiute tradition in Nevada speaks of the Ct-Kar, a race of red-haired giants who were said to be so formidable that the tribes had to unite to trap and exterminate them in what is now known as Lovelock Cave. These are not vague, distant myths. For these cultures, they are historical accounts of their people's past, tied to specific geographical locations and passed down through countless generations. What is so compelling about this global tapestry of stories is that they emerge independently from cultures that had no possible contact with each other. The ancient Hebrews, the Greeks, the Norse, and the Native Americans all developed their own complex narratives about giants without any cross-pollination. This points to something deeper than mere coincidence. It suggests either a shared, ingrained human archetype, perhaps representing our fear of powerful enemies or the unknown forces of nature, or a fragmented memory of something tangible that these disparate cultures all witnessed in the ancient world. These legends form the fertile ground from which all later claims of giant skeletal discoveries would grow, providing a ready-made context that made such finds feel not just possible but expected. And so we arrive at a pivotal moment in our story, a case that perfectly illustrates how myth, prophet, and human credulity can collide to create a sensation that captivates a nation. In the autumn of 1869, in the small town of Cardiff, New York, a remarkable discovery seemed to vindicate all those ancient legends. Workers digging a well on the farm of a man named William Stubb Newell unearthed what appeared to be a petrified giant over 10 feet tall, lying in a grave of dark earth. The news spread like wildfire. Here was tangible, physical proof of a bygone race of giants right in America's own backyard. Crowds flocked to the site, paying 50 cents a head, a significant sum at the time, to gaze in awe at the stony figure. Scientists debated its origins, theologians saw it as proof of the biblical Nephilim, and the public was utterly enthralled. But the truth, which would slowly unravel, was even more fascinating than the fiction. The Cardiff Giant was not a petrified man. It was a 3,000-pound block of gypsum, carefully carved, aged with acid, and hammered with darning needles to simulate pores, all part of an elaborate scheme conceived by a man named George Hull. Hull was a cigar manufacturer and an avowed atheist who was inspired after a heated argument with a Methodist revivalist about the literal truth of the Bible's giants. He decided to create his own evidence to prove just how easily people could be deceived. He commissioned the carving in Chicago, transported the massive statue by rail, and buried it on his cousin Stubb Newell's property, where he let it mature in the earth for a year before discovering it. It was a social experiment born of cynicism and a desire for profit, and it worked beyond his wildest dreams. The giant became a national phenomenon, drawing the attention of the greatest showman of the era, P. T. Barnum. When Barnum was refused the chance to buy the original, he simply created his own, nearly identical replica and exhibited it in New York City, boldly claiming his was the real Cardiff Giant and the original was a fake. The audacity was breathtaking. Soon, the public was presented with two giants, each claiming authenticity, in a perfect display of Barnum's famous axiom that a sucker is born every minute. The ensuing legal battle, where Hull sued Barnum for calling his giant a fake, reached a peak of absurdity when the judge reportedly told the jury, "If this is a genuine petrification, then Barnum is guilty. If it is a fake, then Barnum had a right to fake a fake." The case was eventually dismissed, leaving the public more confused than ever, but the seed of the hoax had been permanently planted in the cultural consciousness. The Cardiff Giant provides us with a perfect blueprint for understanding the anatomy of a successful archaeological hoax. It had all the necessary ingredients: a plausible backdrop rooted in popular legend, a physical artifact that seemed to confirm deeply held beliefs, a media frenzy that amplified the story beyond all reason, and the involvement of charismatic promoters who understood the public's appetite for the marvelous. It preyed on a willingness to believe, showing that when people want something to be true, they will often overlook glaring inconsistencies. Even after Hull himself confessed to the hoax in court, many visitors continued to believe the giant was real, a testament to the power of a compelling story over mere facts. This single event, more than any other, taught hucksters and charlatans a valuable lesson. The public is ripe for deception when you offer them a connection to a mythical past. The ghost of the Cardiff Giant, in many ways, still haunts every subsequent claim of a giant skeleton. It established a playbook that would be used again and again, forcing us to look at every extraordinary discovery not just with wonder, but with a healthy dose of scrutiny, asking not only, "What is this?" but also, who benefits from this story? While the Cardiff Giant was pure spectacle, other sites offered what seemed to be more credible evidence, grounded not in a single hoax but in genuine archaeological excavation. One of the most compelling and often cited locations is Lovelock Cave in Nevada. This site presents a fascinating convergence of tangible physical evidence and powerful indigenous oral tradition, creating a story that has been amplified and distorted for over a century. The real history of Lovelock Cave begins not with archaeologists but with guano miners. In the early 1900s, miners began digging out the deep layers of bat droppings in the cave for fertilizer, and in the process they started to uncover something extraordinary, a vast collection of ancient artifacts and human remains. This prompted a series of official archaeological expeditions, most notably by the University of California and later the Museum of the American Indian, which meticulously recovered thousands of relics. They found duck decoys crafted from reeds, sophisticated fishing gear, intricate baskets, and a trove of other items pointing to a rich, long-term habitation by ancient peoples. Crucially, they also unearthed human skeletons. Some of these remains were reported as being of large stature, with one account from a 1931 Nevada Review Miner article mentioning a pair of skeletons measuring 6 feet 6 inches and 8 feet tall, respectively. It is these specific reports that form the bedrock of the Lovelock Giant legend. This physical evidence seems to find a perfect echo in the oral histories of the Northern Paiute people, whose traditions speak of a conflict with a race of fierce, red-haired cannibals called the Setika. According to their stories, passed down through generations, the Setika were towering, warlike adversaries who posed such a threat that a coalition of tribes finally trapped them in Lovelock Cave. The legend says the tribes piled brush at the entrance and set it ablaze, suffocating the giants inside, and then attacked and killed any who tried to escape. This dramatic tale, when paired with the discovery of large skeletons and the fact that some of the human hair found in the cave was indeed reddish in color, appears to create an airtight case for the historical reality of giants. But when we apply scientific and historical scrutiny, a much more nuanced and equally fascinating picture emerges. Let's first address the most sensational claim: the size of the skeletons. The reported 8-foot-tall skeleton has never been produced for modern analysis. The most reliable accounts from the archaeologists actually working at the site describe individuals who are tall for their population, perhaps in the range of 6 feet to 6 feet 6 inches, but not the mythological 8 or 9-foot giants of lore. In a population where the average height was likely around 5 feet, a person standing 6 feet 4 would have been considered a veritable giant, and their stature easily exaggerated in second-hand reports and newspaper sensationalism. As for the reddish hair, this doesn't necessarily point to a separate, red-haired race. Ancient human hair can biochemically degrade and take on a reddish or auburn hue over centuries of mineral exposure in a cave environment. Furthermore, some of the artifacts found in the cave, like sandals, were massive, but these could have been ceremonial or simply sized for individuals with larger feet, not proof of an entire race of giants. So, what really happened at Lovelock Cave? The evidence strongly suggests it was a site occupied by early ancestors of the Paiute, known as the Lovelock culture, for thousands of years. The cave was a rich resource base, and the so-called giants were likely just tall, robust members of that society. The conflict described in the oral history could very well be a cultural memory of a real, intense struggle between different groups, perhaps a particularly formidable and hostile band of people who were physically distinctive and remembered for their ferocity. Over generations, the memory of this conflict and the stature of these adversaries could have been magnified in the telling, transforming them from formidable foes into supernatural giants. The true story of Lovelock Cave is not one of science debunking myth, but rather of science providing context for it. It shows us how real events can be woven into the cultural fabric of a people, their details heightened and symbolized to convey deeper truths about survival, identity, and the triumph over a terrifying enemy. The cave doesn't prove the existence of literal giants, but it does offer powerful evidence of how the legend of giants is born from the fertile ground of real human experience. After the spectacle of the Cardiff Giant, the blueprint for creating a convincing giant skeleton was firmly established, and modern fabricators have only refined the process with new materials and digital trickery. The creation of a fake giant skeleton often begins with the skeleton itself. A common method involves taking a genuine human skeleton, typically from an anatomical specimen, and carefully modifying it to increase its size. This can be done by cutting the long bones, the femurs, tibias, and humeri, and inserting spacers made from other materials like wood, plastic, or even other bone fragments. The joints are then filled with clay or epoxy and textured to blend seamlessly, creating the illusion of a single, abnormally long bone. Another widespread technique, especially for more crude or hastily assembled fakes, is the use of animal bones. A bear's femur or the scapula of a large mammal can be strategically incorporated into a human frame, creating a hybrid creature that appears both familiar and unnervingly oversized to the untrained eye. The skull often presents the biggest challenge, as a human skull scaled up would look instantly wrong. Fabricators sometimes use sculptures made from papier-mâché, plaster, or resin, aging them with stains and dirt to mimic the patina of centuries. Once the physical prop is constructed, the next crucial step is staging the discovery. The fake skeleton is placed in a shallow, hastily dug pit or arranged within a cave setting. Surrounding it with genuine-looking artifacts, broken pottery, primitive stone tools, or even fake ancient inscriptions adds a layer of false credibility. But the true amplifier of these hoaxes in the modern era is photography. Clever camera angles are everything. By using forced perspective, where the skeleton is placed much closer to the camera than the people or objects around it, a fabricator can make a 6-foot prop appear to be 12 feet long. A person kneeling several feet behind the skeleton, holding a shovel for scale, can be made to look dwarfed by the colossal bones. Low lighting, grainy filters, and blurry focus are all employed not just to hide the imperfections of the construction, but to create a specific mood, one of mystery, discovery, and authenticity. The digital age has taken this even further, with photo editing software allowing for near-seamless composites. A digitally altered image can splice together bones from different sources, erase the telltale wires holding a skull together, or place a fabricated giant into a real archaeological site, creating a visual proof that is incredibly difficult to debunk at a glance. But why do these hoaxes work so well, even when the methods seem obvious in hindsight? The answer lies in a powerful combination of psychological triggers. First, there's the allure of forbidden knowledge. The idea that mainstream science is hiding a monumental truth about our past is deeply appealing. It makes the believer feel like an insider, someone smart enough to see through the official narrative. This ties directly into confirmation bias, our brain's tendency to eagerly accept information that confirms what we already believe. If you are convinced that giants once roamed the earth, a grainy photo of a large skeleton isn't questionable evidence, it's a triumphant vindication. Then there's the powerful role of narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures, and the story of ancient giants is a compelling one. It connects us to the epic scales of myth and scripture, suggesting our world has a more dramatic and mysterious history than the slow, meticulous timeline presented by archaeologists. A dry scientific paper about population genetics can't compete with the visceral thrill of a photograph that seems to show a human femur as long as a car. This appeal is often layered with a distrust of institutions. When museums or universities dismiss a find as a hoax, it can be interpreted not as a careful conclusion based on evidence, but as an attempt by a closed-minded establishment to suppress a truth that upends their authority. The hoaxer in this narrative becomes a rebellious truth-teller, and the believer becomes part of a brave community standing against a powerful, deceptive system. The fake skeleton, then, is more than just a collection of modified bones. It's a physical token that represents a much deeper desire for a world filled with wonder, secrets, and grand hidden histories. While the hoaxers were busy crafting their giants, they found the perfect partner in a rapidly evolving institution, the penny press. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a media revolution. Newspapers became cheaper and more widely available than ever before, leading to intense circulation wars. In this competitive environment, a sober report on a new tariff law was far less likely to sell papers than a breathless account of a 10-foot-tall petrified man dug up from a farmer's field. This was the golden age of sensationalism, where the line between news and entertainment was often blurry, and the motto seemed to be print first, verify later. Publications like the New York Times, which we now consider a bastion of established journalism, were not immune to this trend in their earlier years. They, along with countless local papers, became unwitting amplifiers and sometimes even primary sources for the giant mythos. A typical report would follow a familiar pattern: a dramatic headline, a detailed but uncritical description of the discovery, a quote from a supposed expert or the excited landowner, and a knowing nod to biblical or classical legends, framing the find as a confirmation of ancient truth. The language was rarely cautious or skeptical. It was designed to provoke wonder and, most importantly, to keep readers buying the next edition for updates. Consider a specific example that illustrates this phenomenon perfectly. In 1870, just 1 year after the Cardiff Giant hoax was exposed, the New York Times published a story headlined, "A Giant Skeleton Found." It described the discovery in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, of a skeleton of gigantic proportions measuring a staggering 9 feet, 8 inches in length. The article noted the skull was thick and solid, the jawbone large enough to fit over a man's head, and the bones were all of enormous size. There were no interviews with local doctors or university professors to assess the bones. the account was presented as straightforward fact, with the only source being the men who made the discovery. This single article, reprinted and referenced in other papers, gave the Wisconsin Giant an air of legitimacy that persists in some circles to this day. Yet no museum ever acquired these bones, no follow-up scientific study was ever published, and the entire account simply vanished into the ether of history, leaving behind only the tantalizing, unverified newspaper clipping as evidence. This story was not an isolated incident. From Tennessee to Ohio, from Arizona to West Virginia, similar reports appeared with surprising frequency, each one feeding off the last, creating a powerful echo chamber that made the existence of an ancient race of giants seem not just plausible, but an established and regularly occurring fact. This media frenzy created a self-perpetuating feedback loop of misinformation. A story in a reputable paper like the Times lent credibility to the idea of giants, which in turn made local papers more eager to publish their own local giant finds. Each new report was seen as further confirmation of a growing body of evidence, rather than as a potential hoax or misidentification. This cycle was fueled by a potent mix of public demand and editorial greed. People wanted to read these stories. They were exciting, they were mysterious, and they tapped into a deep-seated cultural fascination. Editors and publishers, recognizing a surefire way to boost circulation, were more than happy to supply the demand. Verification was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. The consequence of this was the creation of a vast, distributed mythology, a paper trail of proof that was almost entirely devoid of physical evidence. When a skeptic would ask, "Where are the bones?" the believer could now point not to a single dubious source, but to dozens of clippings from newspapers across the country, all saying the same thing. The media, in its quest for profit, had effectively built an archive for a history that never happened, cementing the idea of ancient giants in the popular imagination in a way that 1,000 campfire stories alone never could. Now, let's turn to a different kind of misunderstanding, one rooted not in deliberate fraud, but in a genuine yet mistaken interpretation of real discoveries. Throughout history, people have unearthed enormous bones, and without the framework of modern paleontology, they struggled to make sense of them. The most common culprits behind these giant discoveries were the massive prehistoric animals of the Pleistocene epoch, particularly mammoths and mastodons. Imagine a farmer in the early 1800s plowing a field in Ohio or New York when his blade strikes something hard and unyielding. He digs carefully and uncovers a bone longer than his leg, or a skull with tusks curving like scythes, or a molar tooth as large as a brick. Without any concept of extinct elephants roaming ancient America, what else could he possibly conclude? The most logical explanation, drawing from the stories he knew from the Bible or local folklore, was that he had found the remains of a giant human, one of the legendary heroes or monstrous beings from a bygone age. This confusion has a long and fascinating pedigree dating all the way back to the classical world. The ancient Greeks, for instance, had their own explanations for the massive fossils they encountered. They believed that the large, bony plates of extinct mammoths often found in the ground were the actual remains of the heroes and giants from their myths. In fact, the very word mammoth has a later but equally illustrative origin. It comes from the Tatar word mama, meaning earth, reflecting the belief in Siberia that these were the bones of enormous creatures that burrowed through the ground like moles. But long before that term spread, the Greeks had a specific name for what they found. They called these strange, giant bones the bones of Orsts, or the shoulder blade of Pelops, attributing them to their legendary figures. The great historian Thucydides even wrote about how the Spartans, upon discovering a large skeleton, identified it as the hero Orsts and transported it back to their city as a sacred relic, believing it would bring them power in battle. For them, this was not speculation. It was a direct connection to their heroic past, made tangible by the physical evidence lying in the soil. As we move into the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe, the same pattern repeats itself. The discovery of a massive skeleton in Sicily was confidently identified as the Cyclops Polyphemus from Homer's Odyssey, simply because the single, large nasal cavity in the center of an elephant's skull, the opening where the trunk attaches, was mistaken for the eye socket of a gigantic, one-eyed human. This single misinterpretation powerfully shaped the visual depiction of Cyclopes for centuries. Later, when large bones were unearthed in Crete, they were immediately attributed to the Titans or other gigantic beings from myth. The framework for understanding these remains was always the cultural and religious stories that people already knew. The idea of a world before humans, populated by fantastic beasts that no longer existed, was simply not part of the mainstream worldview. The concept of deep time and species extinction wouldn't be scientifically established until the work of Georges Cuvier in the early 19th century. Before that, the Earth was widely believed to be only a few thousand years old, and all creatures were thought to have been created during the same brief period. So when people found bones that didn't match any living animal, the most sensible conclusion was that they belonged to a human, just a much, much larger one. This phenomenon crossed the Atlantic and became deeply embedded in the early history of the United States. As settlers moved westward, they continually stumbled upon the vast fossil graveyards of the American interior. A particularly famous case involved the so-called Giant of Claverack. In 1705, near what is now Albany, New York, a farmer found a tooth weighing over 4 pounds and a thigh bone of immense size. The specimens were sent to the prominent colonial governor, Lord Cornbury, who then shipped them to London. There, they were examined and displayed as the remains of an antediluvian giant, further fueling European speculation about a race of prehistoric titans in the New World. We now know these bones almost certainly belonged to a mastodon. Even some of the founding fathers of the United States were captivated by these finds. Thomas Jefferson, an avid naturalist, was fascinated by the giant bones being unearthed in Kentucky and Virginia. He meticulously collected reports and specimens, and he referred to the mammoth in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, as a powerful rebuttal to the French naturalist Buffon, who had argued that American animals were smaller and degenerate. For Jefferson, the mammoth was a symbol of American strength and vitality, a creature so mighty it might still be roaming the unexplored West. His belief in its possible continued existence shows just how recently the true scale of prehistoric life remained a mystery. The key to unraveling this centuries-long confusion lies in the subtle anatomical differences between human and animal skeletons, distinctions that are obvious to a trained paleontologist but were easily missed by the untrained eye of the past. A mastodon's femur, for example, is thick and column-like, very different from the more gracefully curved human femur. But if you've never seen one before, its sheer size alone is enough to suggest a giant human leg bone. The most common point of misidentification, however, was the teeth. A mammoth or mastodon molar is a remarkable object, a massive, flattened loaf of a tooth, covered in a complex pattern of ridges and peaks designed for grinding tough vegetation. To someone who had never seen an elephant, this tooth bore no resemblance to any known animal. It looked alien, but if you squinted, and if you were already primed by stories of giants, you could convince yourself it was a petrified human tooth just on a colossal scale. Similarly, the vertebrae of these large mammals are robust and disc-shaped. When found scattered and disconnected from the rest of the spine, a single large vertebra could be presented as the wrist bone or kneecap of a giant human, its true function and origin completely obscured by isolation and imagination. This cycle of misidentification was often compounded by a familiar cast of characters, the showmen and promoters who saw an opportunity for profit. They would take these genuine but misidentified animal fossils and present them in a context that deliberately encouraged the giant narrative. They might arrange a few mastodon vertebrae in a line to suggest an impossibly long human spine, or display a single large tooth as definitive proof of a giant's jaw. They provided the story that the public was already eager to hear, and the physical object, however misunderstood, gave that story a powerful sense of reality. So, while the Cardiff Giant was a hoax carved from stone, many of the other giant discoveries throughout history were, in a way, honest mistakes, the result of applying an ancient mythological framework to the breathtaking and bewildering remains of a natural world that was far older and stranger than anyone had ever dreamed. These misinterpretations remind us that the line between myth and science has often been blurred, and that our journey to understand the past is not just about uncovering bones, but about learning how to see them clearly. Just as America had its Cardiff Giant, France experienced its own moment of giant fever, sparked by a discovery that seemed, at first glance, to be far more scientifically credible. In 1890, within the rich archaeological soils of Castille, now Lelez in southern France, the respected anthropologist Georges Vacher de Lapouge unearthed 3 fragments of a human skeleton. These weren't complete, articulated bones. They were pieces of a femur, tibia, and humerus, the long bones of the leg and arm. What made them extraordinary was their sheer mass. Vacher de Lapouge, a meticulous scholar, estimated that the individual these bones came from would have stood between 11 and 12 feet tall. For a moment, the scientific world held its breath. This wasn't a showman's prop dug up on a farm. This was an official find by a recognized academic, published in the scientific journal La Nature. It appeared to be the hard, empirical evidence that the legends had been waiting for. The initial scientific excitement was palpable. The bones were found in a Neolithic burial context, a layer of earth containing tools and artifacts from a period of early human settlement. This context seemed to rule out a hoax and suggested a genuine, if astonishing, chapter in human prehistory. Vacher de Lapouge himself was cautious but clearly intrigued, proposing the name Homo gardarensis for this putative race of giants, drawing a parallel to a similarly large skull find from Greenland. The story, however, was simply too sensational to remain confined to academic journals. It was quickly picked up by the international press, which often dropped the cautious language of the original paper. Headlines proclaimed the definitive discovery of a prehistoric giant race, and the estimated height of 12 feet became a fixed, unassailable fact in the public mind. The find was presented as a European counterpart to the American mound builder giants, a tangible link to the titans of classical mythology. For a brief period, the Giant of Castelnau stood as a monumental challenge to conventional understanding of human evolution. The inevitable process of sober analysis, however, began to chip away at this fantastic narrative. Other scientists of the era expressed immediate skepticism. The primary issue was that the bones were fragments, not complete specimens. Estimating total height from a piece of a femur involves a degree of mathematical extrapolation, and different formulas can produce wildly different results. Critics argued that Vacher de Lapouge's calculations were based on an overly generous interpretation of the bone proportions. More importantly, the sheer biomechanical implications of an 11-foot-tall human were and remain staggering. The square-cube law, a fundamental principle of physics, tells us that if you double a creature's height while keeping its proportions the same, its weight increases by a factor of 8. A human being 12 feet tall would require bones of impossible thickness and density to support its own weight, and its heart would struggle to pump blood to its extremities. Such a creature, from an engineering standpoint, seems unviable. The final and most definitive blow to the giant theory came from a re-examination of the bones themselves. While the original fragments have been lost to history, the detailed descriptions and casts that remain have been studied by modern paleopathologists. Their conclusion is almost unanimous. The morphology of the Castile, now bone fragments, their internal structure, shape, and thickness does not closely match that of a healthy human. Instead, the evidence points strongly toward a condition known as pathological gigantism, most commonly caused by a pituitary tumor that leads to an overproduction of growth hormone. This condition, known as acromegaly in adults, results in a characteristic thickening and enlargement of the bones, particularly in the hands, feet, and jaw. The Castile fragments perfectly fit this profile. They are not the bones of a normally proportioned giant, but of an individual who suffered from a dramatic and debilitating medical condition. This person would have been exceptionally tall for their time, perhaps even approaching 7 or 8 feet, a truly monumental figure in a Neolithic community, but they were not a member of a separate race of giants. They were a human being who lived with a profound and visible difference, their stature likely the source of both awe and immense physical hardship. Yet, the most persistent twist in the Castile story involves a persistent misidentification that echoes the mammoth confusions of earlier centuries. Many modern references to the case, particularly in online articles and documentaries promoting the giant theory, often conflate Vacher de Lapouge's human bone fragments with a completely separate discovery he made in the same region. In 1888, 2 years before unearthing the debated human remains, he had excavated the fossilized bones of a prehistoric elephant, likely a Deinotherium or a straight-tusked elephant. These enormous animal fossils were found in much older Pliocene-era deposits. Over time, in the retelling of the story, these two distinct finds, the pathological human bones from a Neolithic grave and the massive elephant fossils from a far more ancient layer, have been blurred together. Promoters of the giant myth often present photographs of the large, knobby elephant vertebrae as if they were the spinal bones of the Castile giant, creating a visual proof that is both compelling and entirely false. This conflation demonstrates how a kernel of truth, the discovery of some unusually large human bones, can be inflated over time through a combination of honest error, sensationalist storytelling, and the deliberate merging of separate pieces of evidence to construct a more spectacular narrative. The true story of Castile is not one of a lost race, but a far more human tale of medical anomaly, scientific curiosity, and the enduring power of a tall tale to grow even taller with each retelling. The business of giants has always been a lucrative one, stretching far beyond the one-time ticket sales of the Cardiff Giant exhibit. Today, the economic engine that drives the myth forward has evolved into a sophisticated ecosystem of content creation, merchandising, and targeted marketing that preys on a deep-seated human desire for mystery. At its core, this modern industry understands a fundamental truth. Wonder is a product that can be packaged and sold. Consider the sheer volume of self-published books available online, with titles promising to reveal the forbidden archaeology or the suppressed history of a giant race. These publications often bypass traditional peer review and editorial scrutiny, allowing authors to present highly speculative and sometimes completely fabricated evidence as groundbreaking revelation. They are frequently priced at a premium, marketed directly to an audience already inclined to believe that mainstream science is hiding the truth. The same principle applies to a plethora of documentaries and television specials on alternative history channels. These productions are masterfully edited, using dramatic music, ominous voiceovers, and carefully selected talking heads who present themselves as renegade experts. They create a compelling narrative of conspiracy and cover-up, but their primary goal is not education, it's ratings and advertising revenue. The more sensational the claim, the more viewers they attract, and the more profit they generate for their producers and distributors. This business model relies heavily on the creation of a closed information loop. Enthusiasts who buy a book or watch a documentary are often directed to specific websites, online forums, and social media groups that reinforce the very ideas they just consumed. These digital spaces become echo chambers where skepticism is dismissed as closed-mindedness and any demand for verifiable evidence is labeled as blind faith in a corrupt system. Within these communities, a whole new tier of profit emerges. Website owners monetize traffic through display ads and affiliate links, selling everything from survival gear to metaphysical crystals. Content creators run crowd-funded campaigns to finance expeditions to rumored giant burial sites, expeditions that rarely, if ever, produce any credible evidence but generate plenty of dramatic video content for their next series. Some even sell physical products, replica giant skulls, branded t-shirts, or ancient maps showing the lost lands of the giants. The entire ecosystem is designed to keep the consumer within the network, constantly consuming new content and purchasing new products that all confirm the same basic premise. It's a self-sustaining cycle where the myth itself is the most valuable commodity, and its longevity is guaranteed by the continuous flow of money from a dedicated audience to the entrepreneurs who cater to their curiosity. Perhaps the most cynical aspect of this for-profit machine is its strategic targeting of specific cultural and religious groups. The legend of ancient giants holds a particularly powerful sway within certain segments of the creationist and fundamentalist communities, where the existence of giants is seen as direct validation of the biblical narrative. Entrepreneurs within the alternative history sphere have become adept at framing their content to appeal directly to this audience. They use the language of faith, presenting their findings as a defense of Scripture against the attacks of secular science. This creates a powerful emotional and financial bond. Supporters aren't just buying a book, they are funding what they perceive as a holy mission to prove the literal truth of the Bible. This fusion of faith and commerce is incredibly potent, as it makes questioning the evidence feel like a challenge to one's own religious beliefs. The same dynamic plays out in circles focused on various forms of Afrocentrism or indigenous empowerment, where the idea of a lost race of giant ancestors can be woven into narratives of a grand, suppressed historical legacy. In these cases, the financial transaction is layered with a sense of cultural reclamation, making the purchase feel like an act of identity affirmation. This emotional leverage is a key sales tactic, transforming the act of buying into a statement of belief and belonging. Ultimately, the modern giant industry flourishes because it offers something that conventional, evidence-based history often cannot: a sense of epic wonder and personal significance. It tells a story in which the individual viewer or reader is the hero, someone smart enough and brave enough to see through the lies of the powerful. It offers a version of the past that is more dramatic, more mysterious, and more personally meaningful than the slow, meticulous, and often incomplete timeline constructed by archaeologists. When a university explains that a large skeleton is a case of gigantism, the story ends. But when a charismatic documentary host suggests that same skeleton is proof of the Nephilim, the story is just beginning. It opens up a world of conspiracy, hidden knowledge, and cosmic drama. The for-profit promoters are selling more than just books or videos. They are selling an identity. They are offering their audience membership in an exclusive club of truth seekers, a community united against a common, dismissive enemy. This powerful psychological payoff, this feeling of being part of a grand, secret narrative, is what keeps the financial wheels turning. It ensures that as long as there is a market for mystery, there will be someone ready to supply a giant skeleton, a blurry photograph, or a compelling story for a price. So if these skeletons weren't from a lost race of titans, what could possibly explain the occasional unearthing of truly enormous human bones? The answer lies not in mythology, but in modern medicine, specifically in the intricate workings of a tiny gland at the base of our brain, the pituitary. This pea-sized organ is the body's master regulator of growth, and when it malfunctions, the results can be extraordinary, giving us the real-world biological basis for what our ancestors might have called giants. The conditions are known as pituitary gigantism and its related disorder, acromegaly, and understanding them is crucial to demystifying these archaeological finds. Pituitary gigantism occurs when a benign tumor forms on the pituitary gland during childhood or adolescence before the growth plates in the bones have sealed. This tumor causes an overproduction of growth hormone, throwing the body's normal developmental signals into overdrive. The long bones in the arms and legs continue to grow at an accelerated rate, resulting in an individual of extraordinary height, often well over 7 feet. This is a rare and serious medical condition, not a different species of human, and it comes with a host of significant health challenges. To understand the sheer scale of what's possible, we need only look to the modern historical record and the well-documented case of Robert Pershing Wadlow, who remains the tallest person in medical history for whom there is irrefutable evidence. Born in Alton, Illinois in 1918, Wadlow appeared normal at birth, but a hyperplasia of his pituitary gland set him on an unprecedented growth trajectory. By the time he was just 8 years old, he was already over 6 feet tall. His growth never stopped. By age 18, he stood 8 feet 4 inches, and at the time of his death at the young age of 22, he measured an astonishing 8 feet 11.1 inches tall. Wadlow's life, while one of great public fascination, was also one of immense physical difficulty. His immense size placed tremendous strain on his circulatory system and his skeleton. He required leg braces to walk and had very little sensation in his feet. A poorly fitting brace ultimately caused a blister that led to a fatal infection, a stark reminder of the biomechanical fragility that accompanies such extreme stature. His story is not one of mythical power, but of a human being navigating a world not built for his body, a reality that any individual with gigantism in the ancient world would have faced to an even greater degree. Now consider the scenario from an archaeological perspective. Imagine a community living 3,000 or 4,000 years ago in a Neolithic village. The average height for a man might be around 5 feet 4 inches. In this community, one boy develops a pituitary tumor. He grows and keeps growing, eventually towering over everyone else by 2, perhaps even 3 feet. To his people, he is a living giant. He would have been a figure of immense awe, perhaps seen as touched by the gods, or maybe even feared as a monster. His physical presence would have been utterly dominant. When he eventually died, his skeleton, with its massively elongated femurs and thickened bones, would be buried with reverence or perhaps with fear. Centuries or millennia later, an archaeologist, or more likely, a farmer, digs up that one singular, enormous skeleton, without any context, without the understanding that this was a medical anomaly. The most logical conclusion for a past-century naturalist or a modern-day mythmaker would be that they had found a member of a race of giants. They wouldn't have the concept of a pituitary tumor. They would have the concept of Goliath, of the Cyclops, of the Nephilim. One single skeleton with gigantism is all it would take to seed an entire local legend that could then be woven into the cultural fabric for generations. It's also important to distinguish gigantism from its related condition, acromegaly, which can create a different but equally imposing physical appearance. Acromegaly occurs when the pituitary tumor develops in adulthood after the growth plates have fused. Since the long bones can no longer lengthen, the growth hormone has its effect on the body's soft tissues and the bones of the face, hands, and feet. This leads to a characteristic coarsening of the features. The brow ridge and jaw become prominent, the nose widens, the lips thicken, and the hands and feet become broad and spade-like. The skin often thickens and the voice can deepen. If you were to discover a skeleton with a massively thick, heavy skull and oversized, robust hand bones, you might easily assume you had found something not quite human. This acromegalic morphology adds another layer to the mystery because it doesn't just create a tall person. It creates a person who looks fundamentally more robust and powerful, whose very skull seems to have been hewn from a different, heavier stone. When you combine the potential for great height from gigantism with the robust, heavy-boned features of acromegaly, You have a perfect storm of physical attributes that align almost perfectly with our classical descriptions of giants, beings of immense size and strength, with coarse features and a formidable presence. The health implications of these conditions bring a sobering human reality to the legend. Life for an individual with gigantism or acromegaly in the ancient world would have been incredibly challenging and likely short. The same growth that made them so remarkable would have placed an enormous burden on their heart, forcing it to work much harder to pump blood through a vastly larger body. They would have suffered from severe joint pain and arthritis as their skeletal systems struggled to support their weight. Vision problems, headaches, and extreme fatigue would have been common. Their life expectancy would have been low, not just from the direct effects of the tumor, but from the increased susceptibility to infection and injury. This reality stands in stark contrast to the mythological image of the invincible giant. The real giants of history were not supernatural warriors. They were people living with a profound and debilitating medical condition, individuals who likely endured as much suffering as they inspired wonder. Their story is a medical one, a reminder of the powerful and sometimes cruel ways our own biology can shape our lives and in turn shape the stories we tell about our past. Their remains, scattered through time, became the physical anchors for our deepest legends, not because they were from a lost race, but because they represent the outer, extraordinary limits of human physical variation. Moving from the historical confusions of Castelnau and Lovelock, our investigation brings us to the steamy jungles and arid coasts of South America, where a new wave of giant claims has captured the modern imagination. In recent decades, Ecuador and Peru have become the epicenters of a booming alternative archaeology scene, producing a series of sensational finds that are promoted as the ultimate proof of a lost global civilization of giants. One of the most famous figures in this arena is the late German amateur archaeologist and explorer, Father Carlos Miguel Veiga. In the 1960s, Veiga claimed to have discovered a collection of enormous bones in a region of Ecuador he called the Changaminas. His most iconic artifact, which has been featured in countless books and documentaries, is a massive, heavy bone that he identified as a human femur, seemingly from an individual who would have stood over 20 feet tall. This object, along with others from his collection, was later acquired by a well-known American creationist and promoter of alternative history, the late Dr. Ron Wyatt, further amplifying its reach and lending it an air of legitimacy within certain circles. Another prominent case centers on a Peruvian discovery, often referred to as the giant mummies of Paracas. For years, stories and photographs have circulated online showing elongated skulls of immense size, sometimes attached to reconstructed skeletal frames that suggest beings of 7, 8, or even 9 feet in height. These claims are frequently tied to the work of local enthusiasts and are heavily promoted through YouTube channels and websites dedicated to ancient mysteries. The narrative surrounding these South American giants is particularly potent because it taps into the very real and awe-inspiring mysteries of the region's pre-Columbian cultures. The monumental ruins, the sophisticated engineering, and the enigmatic artifacts left behind by civilizations like the Moche, Nazca, and Inca naturally lead to speculation about lost knowledge and even lost races. Proponents argue that the sheer scale of these ancient works, the massive earthworks, the towering walls, must have been built by people of equally massive stature, a notion that resonates deeply with the biblical and local folkloric traditions of giants. However, when these extraordinary claims are subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny, a much clearer, though less sensational, picture emerges. Let's start with the famed Veiga femur. When researchers and skeptics finally had the opportunity to examine this object, its true nature became apparent. The bone was not a human femur at all. Its morphology, its shape, texture, and internal structure was completely inconsistent with human anatomy. Instead, it was conclusively identified as the fossilized bone of a Pleistocene megafauna species, most likely a Megatherium, a type of giant ground sloth that could weigh several tons and stand over 12 feet tall on its hind legs. The confusion is understandable from a lay perspective. A large, weathered fragment of a megafauna leg bone can superficially resemble an oversized human bone, especially if one is already expecting to find evidence of giants. This is a direct parallel to the mastodon confusions of 19th century America, showing that even in the modern era, a lack of paleontological expertise can lead to the same fundamental misidentification. The Peruvian giant mummies have been debunked through a similar process of anatomical analysis. The famously elongated skulls are a genuine archaeological phenomenon, but they are not evidence of a different species. Anthropologists have long known that many ancient Andean cultures, including the Paracas, practiced deliberate cranial deformation. From a very young age, an infant's head would be carefully bound between boards or with tight cloth, a process that over years would gradually reshape the soft, developing skull into an elongated conical form. This was a widespread cultural practice, likely signifying social status, group identity, or a connection to the divine. The resulting skulls are indeed striking and unfamiliar to modern eyes, but they are entirely human. As for the claims of entire giant skeletons, these often rely on a combination of misassembled bones and photographic trickery. In several well-documented cases, giant skeletons displayed in museums or promoted online have been found to be haphazardly assembled from the bones of multiple different individuals, and sometimes even different species, arranged on a bed of sand or cloth to create the illusion of a single enormous frame. The science of anatomy is very specific. The way a humerus articulates with a scapula or a femur fits into a pelvis leaves little room for interpretation. When experts see these reconstructions, they immediately spot the anatomical impossibilities: joints that don't align, bones from different parts of the body placed incorrectly, or elements that are clearly not primate in origin. The individuals promoting these finds often operate within a specific ecosystem that actively resists mainstream scientific validation. They position themselves as brave outsiders challenging a hidebound academic establishment, framing any skepticism as a deliberate cover-up. This narrative is powerfully appealing, as it turns the lack of peer-reviewed evidence into a virtue rather than a weakness. The primary evidence they present is almost always visual photographs and videos, which are highly susceptible to manipulation through forced perspective, as we discussed with modern hoaxes. A person of average height kneeling behind a large skull can be made to look tiny in a carefully framed shot. Furthermore, the financial incentives are significant. These discoveries drive book sales, secure funding for private expeditions, and generate massive online traffic through ad revenue on YouTube and alternative media websites. The Giant of Ecuador or Peru is not just an archaeological artifact. It is a lucrative brand, a content category that reliably attracts views and clicks from a global audience hungry for mystery. Ultimately, the pattern we see in South America is a modern-day echo of the same cycles we've witnessed throughout history. A genuine sense of wonder at the scale of the ancient world, a misidentification of unusual remains, and the powerful amplification of these errors by storytellers and promoters who understand the public's deep-seated desire for a past that is more epic and mysterious. The one presented in textbooks, the real marvels of Ecuador and Peru are the actual, verified achievements of their ancient inhabitants. The incredible metallurgy, the intricate textiles, the astronomical alignments, and the monumental architecture built by people of normal stature whose ingenuity and collective effort were truly gigantic. The scientific debunking of these giant claims is not an attempt to diminish the wonder of the past, but rather to reorient it toward the genuine and equally astounding capabilities of human civilization. While the hoaxes and misidentifications provided the supposed physical evidence, the intellectual framework that gave giants a permanent home in the realm of alternative history was constructed by a very different kind of movement. In the late 19th century, as Charles Darwin's theories challenged traditional religious views and the world seemed to be shrinking under the march of industrialization, a powerful countercurrent emerged, seeking to reconcile ancient spirituality with a new, cosmic vision of human origins. At the heart of this movement was Theosophy, founded by the charismatic and controversial Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Blavatsky and her followers presented a sweeping, intricate cosmology that described human history as a series of root races, each one inhabiting a lost continent and representing a different stage of spiritual evolution. In her seminal work, The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky wove together strands of Eastern religion, Western occultism, and then current scientific speculation to create a grand, alternative history of the world. It was within this elaborate schema that giants found a new and sophisticated purpose. According to theosophical doctrine, our current humanity is the fifth root race. But before us, she taught, were the colossal beings of the fourth root race, the Atlanteans, and before them, the even more gigantic and etheric Lemurians of the third root race. Blavatsky didn't just suggest these earlier races were metaphorically giant. She attributed to them literal, physical stature on a scale that dwarfed modern humans. The Lemurians, she claimed, were hermaphroditic giants with 4 arms and a third eye, who communicated through telepathy and stood dozens of feet tall. The Atlanteans were also described as giants, though less enormous, and were said to have possessed advanced technology and psychic powers that they eventually misused, leading to the cataclysmic sinking of their continent. This narrative did something crucial for the giant mythos. It moved giants from the realm of simple folklore or biblical literalism into a complex pseudo-scientific system. Theosophy provided a seemingly intellectual and spiritual justification for their existence, framing them not as monsters or aberrations, but as our own direct ancestors on a grand evolutionary journey. For those feeling alienated by both mainstream religion and materialistic science, Theosophy offered an all-encompassing, thrilling narrative that made room for miracles, lost worlds, and a hidden history of titans. The influence of Theosophy on 20th century alternative thought cannot be overstated. It created a fertile breeding ground for ideas that mainstream academia rejected, and it established a template for how to blend disparate mythologies into a single, unified theory. This template was eagerly adopted and popularized by a new wave of authors in the mid-20th century, a period of social upheaval and growing fascination with ancient astronauts and lost civilizations. The most influential of these was undoubtedly Erich von Däniken, whose 1968 book Chariots of the Gods became a global phenomenon. Von Däniken's core premise was that the technological marvels and mythological beings of the ancient world were not the products of human ingenuity, but the literal visits of extraterrestrial beings whom our ancestors worshipped as gods. While von Däniken focused primarily on astronauts and their advanced machinery, his framework effortlessly absorbed the idea of ancient giants. If extraterrestrials were experimenting with genetics or creating hybrid beings, as he suggested, then what was to stop them from creating a race of giant humans to serve as laborers or warriors? The giant skeletons reported in mounds and caves could easily be reinterpreted as the failed experiments or leftover remains of these ancient alien geneticists. This fusion of theosophical cosmology and ancient astronaut theory created a powerful, self-reinforcing feedback loop. Theosophy provided the historical and spiritual backdrop, the lost continents of Lemuria and Atlantis, the cycles of root races. Von Däniken and his imitators provided the modern, technological mechanism, the spaceships and genetic manipulation. Together, they offered a complete, alternative explanation for human history that was far more dramatic and emotionally satisfying to many than the slow, random process of evolution by natural selection. In this new narrative, giants were no longer just a curious anomaly. They were evidence of a cosmic intervention, proof that our past was shaped by intelligent designers from the stars. This framework gave a new generation of giant enthusiasts a vocabulary and a set of concepts that sounded sophisticated and revolutionary. They could now speak of hominid hybrids, extraterrestrial genetic manipulation, and pre-Adamite civilizations, using this pseudo-technical language to lend an air of credibility to their claims. The work of these authors effectively built a parallel intellectual universe, complete with its own evidence, its own experts, and its own explanations, where the giant myth could thrive completely insulated from scientific rebuttal. This insulated ecosystem was further cemented by the rise of dedicated publishing houses and, later, internet communities that catered specifically to alternative history. Books by authors like Zecharia Sitchin, who claimed to translate Sumerian tablets describing the Anunnaki, a race of giant extraterrestrial gods who created humanity, flew off the shelves, creating a multi-million-dollar industry. Television shows like In Search of, and later Ancient Aliens, brought these synthesized ideas into millions of living rooms, presenting them with the polished production values of mainstream media. The narrative became self-perpetuating. A viewer who saw an episode about the giant skeletons of Lovelock Cave would then be directed to a book about Theosophy, which would reference von Däniken, who would point back to Blavatsky. This created a closed loop of information where every claim, no matter how dubious its origin, was cross-referenced and validated within the bubble. The goal was no longer to convince mainstream science, but to build a separate, loyal community of believers for whom this interconnected web of myths constituted a superior form of knowledge. The giant, in this context, became a central pillar of a vast and profitable alternative reality, its bones serving as the literal skeleton upon which an entire industry of wonder and speculation was built. Now that we've explored the physical hoaxes and the historical misidentifications, we must confront the evidence that reaches the widest audience today, the photographs. In our digital age, a single compelling image can become a global sensation overnight, cementing the idea of giants in the public mind more effectively than any newspaper article or museum exhibit ever could. Let's conduct a visual autopsy on some of the most infamous examples, breaking down exactly how these convincing illusions are crafted and why they are so effective at bypassing our critical faculties. One of the most widely circulated images, often labeled as the Smithsonian Giant, depicts a team of early 20th century archaeologists excavating a skeleton so large that the men working around it appear as children by comparison. The scene is set in a desert canyon with tents and equipment scattered about, lending an air of authentic excavation. At first glance, it looks like undeniable proof. But a closer, analytical look reveals the digital seams. The lighting on the giant skeleton doesn't match the lighting on the archaeologists and the surrounding landscape. The skeleton appears to be lit from a direct, bright source, almost like a studio flash, while the figures around it are lit by the softer, more diffuse light of the open desert, casting shadows in a completely different direction. This is a classic sign of a composite image where two separate photographs have been stitched together. The issue of scale is another major giveaway. In a genuine archaeological photograph, you would expect to see a scale bar or a common object, like a shovel or a ruler, placed directly next to the find to provide an objective sense of size. In these faked images, the scale is almost always provided by the human figures, but their placement is deliberately deceptive. The people are often positioned several feet behind the focal point of the skeleton, a trick known as forced perspective. This is the same technique tourists use to take pictures where it looks like they're holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. By placing the object close to the camera and the people far away, you can create a drastic and misleading difference in apparent size. In the Smithsonian Giant photo, if you look at the feet of the workers and the supposed ground level of the skeleton's grave, the perspective lines don't align correctly. It feels like the people are standing on a different plane because in the original source images they were. Another famous series of photos, often claimed to be from Saudi Arabia or India, shows a sprawling skeleton half buried in sand, with a solitary figure holding a shovel next to a rib cage that looks as tall as he is. The immediate red flag here is the texture and resolution. The skeleton has a uniform, almost plastic-like texture that stands out sharply against the granular, detailed texture of the surrounding sand. When you zoom in, you can often see pixelation around the edges of the bones where they were cut out from one image and pasted into another. The color matching is also frequently off. The bone color might be too white or too yellow, failing to account for the staining and mineral absorption that would naturally occur from being buried for centuries. Furthermore, the way the sand appears to fall around the bones is physically implausible. In a real excavation, sand and soil would be carefully brushed away, often leaving the bones partially embedded in a matrix of earth. In these fakes, the skeleton often looks like it was just laid on top of the ground, with a cursory digital brushing of sand over its edges that doesn't obey the laws of gravity and deposition. Perhaps the most telling anachronism in many of these images involves the people depicted within them. In one widely shared photo of a giant skull being examined by two men, the clothing and tools are a jumbled mess of time periods. One figure might be wearing a classic pith helmet from the late 1800s, while the other is dressed in modern cargo pants and a synthetic jacket. The equipment on the ground might include wooden-handled brushes next to a bright, contemporary plastic water bottle. These inconsistencies reveal that the photo is a collage pieced together from stock images sourced from different eras and contexts. The creator isn't aiming for historical accuracy. They are aiming for visual impact, grabbing whatever elements convey the idea of archaeology and mashing them together into a scene that feels authentic at a fleeting glance. Our brains are trained to accept a coherent visual narrative, so when we see a group of people gathered around a remarkable object, we initially accept the scene as a whole. It's only when we pause and deconstruct the individual elements that the illusion shatters, revealing a patchwork of digital forgery. The creation of these images is often traced back to digital art contests and online challenges, where the goal is to create the most believable fantasy scene. A famous example is the Giant of Bangalore photo, which was originally created as an entry for an archaeological anomalies contest on the website worth1000.com, a hub for talented digital manipulators. The artist never intended for their work to be taken as real. They were simply demonstrating their skill in Adobe Photoshop. Yet, once such an image escapes the context of its creation and is shared on social media or conspiracy-themed websites, its origin is stripped away. It becomes an orphaned artifact presented with a sensational backstory about a government cover-up or a forbidden discovery. This life cycle, from artistic exercise to smoking gun evidence, demonstrates the vulnerability of our information ecosystem. An image created for fun a decade ago can still be circulating today as definitive proof, its artistic origins long forgotten by the millions who encounter it. The persistence of these faked photographs speaks to a deeper truth about how we process visual information in the 21st century. We are inundated with images, and we often lack the time or the tools to critically evaluate each one. Our brains use cognitive shortcuts, and one of the most powerful is social validation. If a photo is shared by a friend or by a page we follow and trust, we are more likely to accept it as true without deep analysis. This is compounded by confirmation bias. When we see an image that aligns with what we already believe about giants being real, we are far less likely to scrutinize its flaws. The photograph becomes a token, a shareable piece of evidence that reinforces a community's worldview. Debunking each individual fake is a game of whack-aim-mole because the emotional appeal of the image is far stronger than the logical rebuttal. The real power of these pictures isn't in their technical perfection, but in their ability to tap into our wonder and our suspicion, providing a visual anchor for a story we desperately want to be true. So where does this leave us when we strip away the myths and the hoaxes and look squarely at what the actual fossil record and anthropological data tell us about human height? The scientific story of human stature is no less fascinating than the legends, revealing a complex tapestry of adaptation, nutrition, and evolution. To begin, our early ancestors were, for the most part, quite short by modern standards. Fossil evidence from Homo erectus, who walked the Earth for nearly 2 million years, suggests an average height for males of around 5 feet 6 inches and for females around 4 feet 9 inches. The famous Neanderthals, often mischaracterized as hulking brutes, were actually quite robust and powerfully built, but they were not giants. Male Neanderthals averaged about 5 feet 5 inches, while females were around 5 feet 1 inch. Their stocky, muscular physique was a brilliant adaptation for conserving heat in the cold climates of Ice Age Europe. As we move into the era of our own species, Homo sapiens, the picture remains one of generally modest stature for much of our history. During the Upper Paleolithic period, from roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, the height of hunter-gatherers varied significantly based on their environment and the richness of their food sources. Some of the tallest prehistoric humans were the Gravettian hunters of Europe, with males averaging around 5 feet 10 inches, a height not commonly seen again in Europe until the mid-20th century. This impressive stature was likely fueled by a protein-rich diet from hunting mammoth and other large game across the open steppes. In contrast, populations in other parts of the world, or during periods of resource scarcity, were considerably shorter. The transition to agriculture, which began around 12,000 years ago, marked a surprising and dramatic turning point. Contrary to what one might expect, the adoption of farming often led to a decline in human height. Studies of skeletal remains from the Neolithic period show a significant drop, with average height sometimes falling by several inches. Why would this happen? The answer lies in a less diverse and more nutrient-poor diet centered on a few staple grains, leading to a rise in nutritional deficiencies. Furthermore, the sedentary, densely populated lifestyle of early farmers facilitated the spread of infectious diseases which stunted growth in children. This pattern held for millennia. The average height of a European man during the Roman Empire was around 5 feet 5 inches, and it fluctuated but generally did not surpass that mark until the modern era. This brings us to the documented extremes of human height. The tallest reliably measured person in modern history was Robert Wadlow, whom we mentioned earlier, at 8 feet 11 inches. The tallest living man is Sultan Kursun from Turkey, who stands 8 feet 2.8 inches, also due to a pituitary tumor. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the shortest measured adult was Chandra Bahadur Dangi from Nepal at just 1 foot 9.5 inches. These individuals represent the absolute outer biological limits, the 1 in a billion results of specific medical conditions or genetic anomalies. They are the exceptions that prove the rule. What anthropology and biomechanics tell us is that a healthy, naturally occurring human being standing 9 or 10 feet tall is a biological impossibility. The square cube law is an unforgiving master. If you were to simply scale up a 6-foot-tall person to 10 feet, their volume and weight would increase cubically, but the cross-sectional strength of their bones would only increase squared. Their bones would be too slender to support their massive weight, their joints would fail under the immense strain, and their circulatory system would be unable to efficiently pump blood to their extremities. This is why the skeletons of individuals with pathological gigantism, like those from Castelnau, show such distinct and abnormal thickening. The body is desperately trying to reinforce the bones against forces they were never evolved to handle. When we examine the archaeological record for the tallest known naturally occurring humans, we find individuals who are certainly remarkable for their time but far from mythical. The record for the tallest prehistoric skeleton from a healthy individual is often attributed to a Bronze Age warrior from a site in modern-day Germany, who stood around 6 feet 2 inches, very tall for his era but perfectly within the human range. Even the famously tall ancient Norse, whose skeletons from Viking burials often measure in the 5'10" to 6' range, were not the hulking behemoths of popular imagination. The key takeaway from centuries of anthropological study is that human height has always shown variation, but that variation has firm boundaries. The discovery of a skeleton measuring 7 feet tall would be exceptionally rare but scientifically explainable as a case of gigantism. A skeleton reported as 8 or 9 feet tall, however, immediately falls into the realm of either hoax, misidentification, or the exaggeration of a very tall individual's proportions after death. The true story of human stature is not one of lost races of titans, but a powerful narrative of how our bodies have been shaped by diet, disease, climate, and the relentless pressures of natural selection. It's a story that reveals our species' incredible adaptability and the very real biological constraints that have always defined the human form. This brings us to one of the most stubborn and pervasive narratives in the entire giant mythology: the accusation that the Smithsonian Institution, America's premier museum and research complex, has been actively suppressing the truth. The story goes something like this. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the Smithsonian was funding archaeological digs across the United States, its field agents routinely unearthed giant skeletons. But instead of cataloging and displaying these revolutionary finds, the institution's directors, driven by a dogmatic commitment to mainstream science or perhaps even a darker agenda, ordered the bones to be secretly destroyed or locked away in deep vaults to protect the established narrative of human history. This conspiracy theory provides a perfect, all-purpose explanation for the most frustrating question believers face: if there were so many giants, where are the bones now? The answer, they claim, is that the evidence isn't lost, it's hidden. The origins of this specific conspiracy are deeply entwined with the history of American archaeology itself, particularly the era of the mound builder explorations. In the 1800s, thousands of ancient earthen mounds dotted the American landscape, and there was intense public and scientific debate about who had built them. Many white settlers of the time found it difficult to believe that the Native American tribes they were displacing could have been responsible for such sophisticated earthworks. This gave rise to the mound builder myth, the idea that a lost, more advanced race, often speculated to be Vikings, Phoenicians, or even one of the lost tribes of Israel, had once inhabited the continent and been wiped out by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. When Smithsonian-affiliated archaeologists like Cyrus Thomas began systematically investigating these mounds in the late 1880s under the Bureau of American Ethnology, their findings, published in a massive 1,894 report, concluded that the mound builders were in fact the ancestors of the Native Americans. This was a landmark in scientific archaeology, but it angered and disappointed those who preferred the more romantic lost race theory. In this climate of contested history, any report of a large skeleton found in a mound could be seized upon by the losing side as proof that the Smithsonian was ignoring evidence that didn't fit its preferred conclusion. Fueling this fire were genuine instances of loss and poor record-keeping, which are common in the early history of any large-scale scientific endeavor but are easily reinterpreted as sinister acts. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeological standards were far less rigorous than they are today. Specimens were often poorly documented, shipped in crates with minimal labeling, and sometimes stored in conditions that led to their deterioration or loss. A catalogue number might be misrecorded, a box might be misplaced in a vast warehouse, or a fragile bone might simply crumble to dust after being unearthed. For a conspiracy theorist, however, this mundane reality of institutional fallibility is not an explanation, it's a cover story. The fact that a specific giant skeleton mentioned in an 1895 newspaper article cannot be located in the Smithsonian's collections today is not seen as a result of poor curation a century ago. It is presented as definitive proof that the institution deliberately made it disappear. The conspiracy found its most powerful modern amplifier with the rise of the Internet, and specifically through the work of a few key individuals. One of the most influential was the late journalist and ufologist Frank Joseph. In his writings and interviews, Joseph repeatedly claimed to have inside information from a mysterious, disgruntled Smithsonian curator who confessed to him that the institution maintained a secret policy of destroying giant bones. He never provided this curator's name, any documentation, or a single verifiable piece of evidence to support this astonishing claim. Yet the story was repeated so often that it took on a life of its own. Another major source is the so-called Kincaid Cave story, which first appeared in an Arizona newspaper in 1909. It described the discovery of a vast labyrinthine cave in the Grand Canyon filled with Egyptian or Asian-looking artifacts and mummies, including a giant. The story was a clear work of fiction, a popular genre of the time known as a humbug, designed to sell newspapers, despite there being no evidence the cave ever existed, and the Smithsonian itself issuing statements for decades denying any involvement. The story is persistently cited as a real discovery that the institution covered up. When we examine the actual workings of the Smithsonian, the conspiracy theory completely unravels. First, consider the scale of such an operation. The Smithsonian is not a single, monolithic entity, but a massive federation of museums, research centers, and archives, staffed by thousands of curators, archaeologists, archivists, and students. To believe in the cover-up, you must also believe that for over a century, not a single one of these thousands of employees, many of whom are dedicated scholars fiercely protective of their academic freedom and reputations, has ever come forward with a single piece of physical evidence, like a photograph of a hidden vault or a stolen bone sample. The idea that an institution whose entire raison d'etre is the discovery and preservation of knowledge would systematically destroy the most groundbreaking archaeological finds imaginable is fundamentally illogical. A genuine giant skeleton would be the crown jewel of any museum in the world, guaranteeing eternal fame, massive funding, and a revolutionary place in the history of science for everyone involved in its study. There is no incentive to hide it. The incentive is overwhelmingly to announce it to the world. Furthermore, the Smithsonian's record-keeping, while imperfect in the past, is now a model of modern museum practice. Its collections are meticulously catalogued in digital databases, and its repatriation office works constantly to return Native American remains and artifacts to their respective tribes under federal law. This process of repatriation is sometimes pointed to as further evidence of a cover-up, with the claim that the Smithsonian is giving away the evidence. In reality, this is a respectful and legal effort to rectify past wrongs, and it involves extensive documentation that is open to tribal representatives. If the institution were secretly housing warehouses full of giant skeletons, this process would have exposed them long ago. The conspiracy theory ultimately serves a specific psychological purpose. It resolves the painful cognitive dissonance between a deeply held belief and a complete lack of physical proof. It's far more comforting to believe that a powerful enemy is hiding the truth than to accept that the evidence you so desperately want to exist simply isn't there. The Smithsonian, as a symbol of established authority, becomes the perfect villain in a story where the believer is the heroic truth seeker, fighting against a system determined to keep them in the dark. But long after the Cardiff Giant was exposed and the scientific explanations were published, the figure of the ancient giant refused to fade into history. Instead, it found a powerful new lease on life, migrating from the pages of newspapers and the tents of showmen directly into the vibrant, sprawling landscape of modern popular culture. This is where the myth was not just preserved, but actively reimagined and amplified for new generations, ensuring its grip on our imagination remained as strong as ever. Consider the monumental shift that occurred with the rise of cinema. Early fantasy films and serials often drew directly from these well-known legends, presenting giants as monstrous relics of a forgotten age. But it was the epic scale of mid-20th century Hollywood that truly cemented their place in our collective mind's eye. The 1958 film, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad from Ray Harryhausen, didn't just show a giant. It brought a living, breathing, stop-motion colossus to the screen, a creature of bone-rattling footsteps and earth-showing power that felt tangibly real. This was no longer a static skeleton in a museum case. It was a dynamic, terrifying force of nature. Harryhausen's genius was in making the mythical physical, and his iconic Cyclops became the definitive visual representation of a giant for an entire generation, directly linking the creatures of Greek myth to the sensational newspaper reports of old. This cinematic tradition evolved and grew more sophisticated, reflecting changing cultural anxieties. In the 1990s, films like The Giant of Thunder Mountain wove the legend into a classic American Western setting, connecting it to themes of hidden gold and frontier secrets. The giant was no longer just a monster to be slain, but a tragic figure, a lost remnant guarding a forgotten truth. This added a layer of pathos and mystery, deepening the emotional resonance of the myth. Then, with the new millennium, the blockbuster entertainment industry fully embraced the giant as a central pillar of world building. The Lord of the Rings film trilogy presented us with cave trolls and the ancient, tree-like Ents, but it was the colossal, siege-breaking warriors of the Battle of Helm's Deep who showcased giants as living engines of war, fulfilling their mythological role as world-shaking forces. Similarly, the Harry Potter franchise populated its magical world with gentle, misunderstood giants like Grop, while also hinting at a brutal, ancient history of giant wizard wars, cleverly mirroring the real-world themes of conflict and coexistence found in native folklore. The interactive realm of video games took this immersion a crucial step further, allowing players to not just witness giants but to confront them directly. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is a masterclass in this. Encountering a giant in its vast open world is a memorable event. You see them from a distance, herding their mammoths across the tundra, their sheer scale making the ground tremble. The game doesn't announce them with a fanfare. It presents them as a natural, if terrifying, part of the landscape. This environmental storytelling makes the myth feel organic and believable. Engaging one in combat is a lesson in humility, as a single swing of its club can send your character flying comically into the stratosphere, a moment that has become a viral meme in its own right, further propagating the image of the giant in digital culture. Other franchises like God of War have entire pantheons of giant gods and titans, framing them as the literal foundation of the world and the source of all conflict. This interactivity transforms the giant from a passive image on a screen into an active, unforgettable experience, forging a personal connection between the player and the myth that is far more potent than any story told in a book. Perhaps the most significant evolution, however, has occurred on the decentralized global stage of the internet. Online forums, wikis, and social media platforms have become the new penny presses, the new exhibition halls, and the new archaeological societies for the giant mythology. Enthusiasts from all over the world can now gather in digital spaces like Reddit or dedicated conspiracy theory websites to share evidence, curate massive archives of those debunked photographs we discussed, and build elaborate collaborative theories that blend biblical scripture, alternative archaeology, and ancient astronaut lore into a single, seamless narrative. The internet acts as a powerful echo chamber where a single, blurry image of a large bone can be shared, analyzed, and championed by thousands, gaining a false credibility through sheer repetition. YouTube algorithms, by recommending one giant-related video after another, create a personalized feedback loop that constantly reinforces the belief system for any user who shows even a passing interest. In this new digital ecosystem, the myth is no longer a static story. It's a living, breathing, and ever-expanding universe of user-generated content. The original hoaxes of the 19th century were localized and eventually faded. Today, a new, giant discovery can be fabricated in a photo editing program in one country and be seen by millions around the globe within hours, its digital footprint instantly becoming part of the permanent, searchable record that future mythmakers will draw upon. This constant, low-grade hum of online speculation ensures that the question of ancient giants never truly goes away, always finding a new audience eager to believe that the greatest secrets of our past are still waiting, just beneath the surface, to be uncovered. At the heart of this entire mystery lies a far more intriguing question than where the bones are. Why does the idea of giants resonate so powerfully with us century after century, even in the face of overwhelming scientific explanation? The answer isn't found in an archaeological dig, but in the very wiring of the human brain. We are, by nature, pattern-seeking creatures. This trait is a fundamental survival skill. Our ancestors who quickly connected the rustle in the grass to a potential predator lived to pass on their genes. But this same hardwired impulse has a shadow side, apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. When we hear a Native American legend about the CT car and then read a 19th century newspaper account of a large skeleton found in a cave, our brain instinctively wants to link these two dots. It feels intuitively correct, creating a satisfying narrative chain that seems to confirm a deep truth. This is the same cognitive engine that leads us to see faces in clouds or constellations in the stars. The giant myth provides a grand, interconnected pattern that feels more significant and thrilling than the disconnected, often mundane explanations of science. A simple case of gigantism here, a misidentified mastodon bone there. The story of a lost race is a complete, compelling picture. The scientific reality is a collection of scattered, unrelated facts. Our minds crave the picture. This longing for a more epic and mysterious past is another powerful psychological driver. The timeline of human history presented by mainstream science is incredibly long and often slow, dominated by gradual shifts in climate, technology, and social organization. It can feel impersonal and even disappointingly ordinary. The idea of a race of giants, however, injects drama and grandeur into that timeline. It suggests a past filled with heroes and monsters, cataclysmic wars, and lost epochs of unimaginable splendor. This narrative is simply more emotionally satisfying. It connects us to the epic scales of our oldest stories, from the Bible to the Eddas to the myths of the Greeks. Believing that our world was once home to such beings makes the landscape itself feel more charged with meaning. An ordinary mound in Ohio transforms from a simple burial site into a potential tomb of a forgotten titan. A cave in Nevada becomes the stage for an ancient, desperate battle for survival. This desire for a wondrous past is a form of escapism from a modern world that can often feel sanitized, explained, and stripped of mystery. The giant myth offers a return to a time when the world was wilder, more dangerous, and far more magical. This ties directly into the powerful allure of lost civilizations and hidden knowledge. The giant narrative is rarely just about the giants themselves, it's about what their existence implies. If a race of giants truly walked the earth, then everything we think we know about history is wrong. This is a deeply appealing concept, especially for those who feel disenfranchised or distrustful of established institutions. It creates a world where the true story is not found in textbooks but is hidden, waiting to be discovered by brave, independent truth seekers. This positions the believer as an insider, part of a privileged group that can see through the official narrative. The appeal is the appeal of the secret, the feeling that you possess a special understanding of the world that the masses, duped by the system, lack. This is why the conspiracy theories about the Smithsonian are so persistent and emotionally charged. They are not just about bones, they are about a fundamental power dynamic. Believing in the cover-up transforms the believer from a passive recipient of information into an active rebel against a corrupt authority, a role that can feel profoundly empowering. Furthermore, giants serve as potent, universal symbols that can be molded to fit a vast array of human anxieties and aspirations. On one level, they can represent the overwhelming forces of nature, the earthquake, the flood, the untamable wilderness that our ancestors had to conquer. The stories of defeating giants are allegories for humanity's struggle to impose order on a chaotic world. On another level, giants can symbolize our own personal demons and insecurities, the seemingly insurmountable challenges we face in our own lives. The act of slaying the giant in a myth becomes a metaphor for overcoming great adversity, a timeless story of the underdog's triumph. In a more modern context, the giant can even represent fears of societal collapse or fears of the other, a monstrous, overpowering force that threatens our way of life. The myth is so durable because it is so flexible. It provides a blank canvas onto which we can project our deepest collective fears and our most cherished hopes about power, identity, and our place in the cosmos. Ultimately, the persistence of the giant myth speaks to a fundamental human need for a sense of scale and significance in a vast and often indifferent universe. The thought that we are merely the current inhabitants of a planet that has seen countless other civilizations, some of them populated by beings of immense power and stature, makes human history feel more consequential. It suggests that our story is part of a much larger, more dramatic epic. This stands in stark contrast to the potentially lonely and impersonal narrative of a single species evolving on a small rock in a remote corner of the galaxy. The giant myth provides a form of cosmic companionship, a sense that the world is older, stranger, and more filled with wonders than we can possibly imagine. It is a testament to the boundless power of the human imagination, our incredible ability to look at a fragment of a mammoth bone, or the skeleton of a person who lived with a tragic medical condition, and from it weave a legend of gods, monsters, and a lost world that continues to captivate us, not because it is true, but because on some deep primal level we feel that it should be. So how does modern science cut through these layers of myth, hoax, and speculation to arrive at the truth? When a set of unusually large or strangely shaped skeletal remains is discovered today, it doesn't go to a showman or a newspaper editor. It enters the meticulous world of forensic anthropology and archaeology, a discipline built on a foundation of rigorous, multi-stage scientific analysis. The journey from a mysterious bone in the ground to a definitive identification is a fascinating detective story in its own right, one that relies on a powerful toolkit of dating methods, genetic testing, and detailed physical examination. The first and most critical step happens right at the discovery site. Professional archaeologists don't just dig, they excavate with painstaking care, documenting the exact position of every bone and every associated artifact. This context is everything. They note the soil layer or stratum in which the remains were found, as deeper layers are typically older. They look for grave goods, pottery, tools, or weapons buried with the individual, which can provide immediate cultural clues. They also search for evidence of the burial itself, like the outline of a coffin or the specific positioning of the body, which can indicate ritualistic practices. This careful documentation creates an unbreakable chain of custody and context, ensuring that when the bones are moved to a lab, they carry their story with them, preventing the kind of context-free speculation that fuels so many myths. Once the remains are securely in the laboratory, the investigation splits into several parallel paths. the first of which is determining when this person lived. This is where dating methods come into play, and the most famous of these is radiocarbon dating. This technique doesn't measure the age of the bone itself, but the age of the carbon within it. All living things absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive isotope called carbon-14. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing carbon, and the carbon-14 it contains begins to decay at a very predictable rate. By measuring the remaining amount of carbon-14 in a small sample of bone or tooth, scientists can calculate how long ago that organism died. This method is incredibly powerful for remains that are up to about 50,000 years old. For more recent centuries, another technique called stable isotope analysis can provide clues. By analyzing the ratios of different isotopes of elements like strontium, oxygen, and lead that are locked into the teeth and bones, scientists can often determine where a person grew up and what their diet consisted of, painting a picture of their life and movement across the landscape. Simultaneously, a physical anthropologist will conduct a thorough morphological study of the skeleton. This is the art and science of reading the bones. Every bone tells a story about the life of the individual. The pelvis and skull are the primary indicators of biological sex. The wear and eruption of teeth, the fusion of certain bone growth plates, and the degeneration of joints provide a reliable estimate of age at death. Marks on the bones can reveal lifelong activities. Robust arm bones might suggest intense physical labor, while certain dental patterns could indicate using teeth as tools. Most importantly for our investigation into giants, the anthropologist will take a long series of precise measurements of the long bones, particularly the femur. There are well-established mathematical formulas that use femur length to estimate a living person's height. If a skeleton suggests an individual was 7 feet tall, this is not a guess. It's a calculated estimate based on population-specific data. Furthermore, they will be looking for the telltale signs of pathological conditions. Does the bone structure show the thickening and unusual growth patterns characteristic of acromegaly or pituitary gigantism? Are there signs of other genetic or nutritional disorders that could affect stature? This morphological analysis separates the simply tall individual from the one with a diagnosable medical condition. In the modern era, one of the most powerful tools in the forensic toolkit is DNA analysis. By extracting genetic material from the ancient bone, scientists can answer questions that are impossible from physical examination alone. First, they can confirm the species. Is this bone even human? As we've seen, many giant finds have turned out to be the remains of extinct megafauna like mammoths or giant sloths. DNA can instantly confirm this. If it is human, genetic analysis can reveal an individual's ancestral origins, linking them to specific geographic populations and migration patterns. It can also identify specific genetic mutations known to cause growth disorders. For instance, many cases of pituitary gigantism are caused by mutations in a gene called AIP. Finding such a mutation in ancient DNA would provide rock-solid molecular evidence that an individual was a giant, not from a separate race, but due to a verifiable medical condition. Finally, all of this evidence is synthesized into a comprehensive biological profile. The date from the carbon testing, the life history from the isotopes, the physical description from the morphology, and the genetic story from the DNA all come together. This profile doesn't just state a height, it reconstructs a human life, placing that individual in a specific time, place, and cultural context. It explains the anomaly rather than simply marveling at it, replacing the sensational headline with a nuanced, evidence-based narrative that honors the actual story written in the bones. While showmen and promoters were busy crafting their giants, a different breed of individual was quietly at work. The skeptic, armed with nothing but a sharp mind, a critical eye, and a deep respect for evidence. These were the debunkers, the truth hunters who saw through the spectacle and dedicated themselves to exposing the frauds, often at great personal cost. One of the earliest and most tenacious of these figures was a man named Andrew White, a respected academic and the first president of Cornell University. When the Cardiff Giant sensation swept the nation, White was not swayed by the public frenzy. He traveled to see the giant for himself and immediately recognized it for what it was, a crude statue. He published a scathing critique pointing out the absurdity of a petrified man, showing the clear tool marks of a sculptor's chisel. His voice was one of reason in a cacophony of credulity, and he used his considerable intellectual authority to challenge the hoax head-on, laying the groundwork for a scientific approach to such claims. But perhaps the most satisfying moment in the Cardiff story came from the geologist Othniel Charles Marsh, a towering figure in American paleontology. Marsh took one look at the giant and delivered a verdict that has become legendary in skeptical circles. He declared it, quote, a very decided humbug. He noted that the gypsum showed fresh tool marks and had not been in the ground nearly long enough to petrify. His word, backed by his impeccable scientific reputation, was a crucial nail in the coffin of the giant's credibility, demonstrating the power of expert analysis over popular opinion. Moving into the 20th century, the mantle of skepticism was taken up by a new kind of investigator, the professional magician and escape artist. No one understood the art of deception better than the great Harry Houdini. After a career spent creating illusions, Houdini developed a passionate second act dedicated to exposing fraudulent spiritualists and psychics who preyed on the grieving. He brought this same meticulous, hands-on approach to other paranormal claims, including archaeological hoaxes. Houdini's method was simple but powerful. He would learn how a trick was done, then replicate it himself to demonstrate its mechanics to the public. While there's no record of him building a fake giant, his philosophy of investigation became a cornerstone of modern skepticism. He believed that extraordinary claims required not just skepticism, but active, practical testing. If someone claimed a skeleton was real, the burden was on them to prove it. The skeptic's role was to devise a test that could break the illusion. This empirical, show-me approach directly influenced the next generation of debunkers, teaching them that to understand a hoax, you often have to think like a hoaxer. In the latter half of the 20th century, this skeptical mission became institutionalized with the founding of organizations like the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, now known as the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, or CSI. This group brought together scientists, philosophers, and magicians in a unified front against pseudoscience. A central figure in this movement was the astronomer Carl Sagan, who, while not a dedicated giant debunker, provided the intellectual framework that all modern skeptics use. His famous dictum, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," is the golden rule of critical thinking. He argued that the more fantastical a claim is, the more robust and independently verifiable the evidence must be before we should accept it. Applying this to giant skeletons, the claim isn't just that an unusually tall person was found. It's that an entire, previously unknown race of humans, defying known biomechanical laws, once existed. That is an extraordinary claim. The evidence, therefore, cannot be a single, blurry photograph or a long-lost newspaper article. It would require a complete, professionally excavated skeleton, along with genetic material, carbon-dated soil samples, and peer-reviewed analysis published in a major scientific journal. Sagan's principle gives skeptics a powerful tool to push back against the low-quality evidence typically offered in support of such myths. Today, the hunt for the truth about giants plays out largely online, and one of its most prominent modern warriors is Sharon Hill, a geologist and science educator who runs the website Doubtful News. Hill represents the evolution of the skeptic into a digital journalist and community manager. she and her team tirelessly monitor the internet for new claims of giant skeletons, ancient aliens, and other paranormal phenomena, applying immediate critical scrutiny. Her method is a model of modern debunking. First, she practices reverse image searching using tools like Google Image Search or Tine to trace a giant skeleton photo back to its original source, which is often a digital art contest or a fantasy photography site. Next, she engages in what she calls source criticism, evaluating the credibility of the person or outlet making the claim. Is it a known conspiracy theory website? Is the expert cited someone with actual archaeological credentials? Then she looks for the hallmarks of a hoax we discussed earlier: inconsistent lighting, forced perspective, and anatomical impossibilities. Finally, she publishes her findings in clear, accessible language for the public. Hill's work is crucial because she operates at the speed of the internet, offering a rational counter-narrative while a viral story is still spreading, effectively inoculating the public against misinformation before it can take root. Another pivotal modern figure is Ken Feder, a professor of archaeology and the author of the classic skeptical text, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology. Feder takes a more pedagogical approach, using these hoaxes as teaching moments to explain how real archaeology works. In his lectures and writings, he systematically dissects the most famous giant claims, from Lovelock to the internet sensations. He doesn't just say they're fake, he walks his audience through the precise archaeological and biological reasons why. For instance, he explains the square-cube law not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality that makes a 12-foot-tall human an engineering impossibility. He highlights the red flags that professional archaeologists are trained to spot: the lack of provenance, the absence of associated cultural artifacts, and the failure of the claims to be submitted to a legitimate scientific journal. Feder's great contribution is contextualization. He shows that the giant skeleton myth isn't an isolated curiosity, but part of a larger pattern of pseudo-history that includes Atlantis, ancient astronauts, and psychic archaeology. By connecting these dots, he helps people develop a general skepticism, a toolkit they can use to evaluate any extraordinary claim, not just ones about giants. The work of these debunkers, from Andrew White to Sharon Hill, is often thankless. They are frequently met with hostility and accusations of being closed-minded spoilsports or agents of a shadowy establishment. But their motivation is not to crush wonder, it is to defend the integrity of a process, the scientific method. That is humanity's best tool for understanding the genuine wonders of the real world. They remind us that the truth, though sometimes less immediately thrilling than a myth, has a depth and a richness that no hoax can ever match. The story of a person with gigantism who lived and died thousands of years ago is, in its own way, more moving and profound than the story of a mythical Nephilim. It's a story of human variation, medical adversity, and the awe that a single individual could inspire in their community. The debunkers don't take that story away. They simply ensure it's told accurately, honoring the real human past instead of a fabricated fairy tale. Their relentless pursuit of the facts ensures that our sense of wonder is directed at the authentic mysteries of history, which are astonishing enough on their own terms. At the very foundation of the modern giant myth, providing an unshakable bedrock of belief for millions, lies the power of sacred text. For a significant portion of those who hold fast to the reality of ancient giants, the debate was settled not by an archaeologist's trowel, but by a divine pen thousands of years ago. The most pivotal passage comes from the 6th chapter of Genesis, a few enigmatic verses that have spawned centuries of interpretation, controversy, and fervent conviction. It states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." Within the framework of biblical literalism, these are not metaphors or allegories, they are historical reportage. The sons of God are understood by many to be angelic beings, and their offspring with human women were the Nephilim, a term often directly translated as giants or the fallen ones. This single ancient description provides a theological mandate for the existence of giants, framing them as a real hybrid race that once walked the earth, their presence so corrupting that it contributed to God's decision to send the Great Flood. This literalist interpretation creates a powerful feedback loop between faith and alleged evidence. When a believer who accepts the Genesis account as inerrant history then encounters a 19th century newspaper clipping about a giant skeleton found in an Ohio burial mound, it isn't seen as a potential hoax or a misidentified mastodon bone. It is viewed as a modern-day confirmation of an ancient biblical truth. The discovery doesn't require scrutiny, it demands celebration. It becomes a piece of a divine puzzle falling into place, a tangible sign that the scriptures are being vindicated by the very soil under our feet. This perspective fundamentally alters the standard of proof. Within this worldview, the burden is reversed. It is not up to the believer to prove the giant skeleton is real. It is up to the scientific establishment to explain why it isn't, and any such explanation is immediately viewed through a lens of suspicion. A scientific paper diagnosing gigantism is not a medical diagnosis. It is an attempt by a secular, often perceived as hostile, institution to explain away a miracle. A museum's statement that a particular set of large bones belongs to an extinct animal is not a correction. It's a cover-up, part of a broader spiritual battle to undermine the authority of the Word of God. This dynamic is powerfully illustrated by the work of certain creationist ministries and alternative archaeology authors who specifically target a Christian audience. They expertly weave together snippets of scripture, out-of-context quotes from academics, and photographs of questionable artifacts to build a seemingly irrefutable case. Their books, DVD, and conference lectures are not designed to persuade secular scientists. They are created to arm the faithful with answers, to fortify them against the doubts sown by the modern world. They present themselves as courageous truth-tellers, defending the faith against the onslaught of godless evolution and millions of years of deep time. For their followers, accepting the existence of giants becomes an act of religious fidelity. To doubt the giant skeletons is, in a very real sense, to doubt the Bible itself. This fusion of identity and belief creates a remarkable imperviousness to counter-evidence. When your very sense of spiritual self is tied to the truth of a claim, factual rebuttals are not merely incorrect, they are spiritually dangerous. The psychological mechanism at work here is known as worldview backfire effect. When a deeply held belief is challenged by contradictory evidence, the common human response is not to re-evaluate the belief, but to reject the evidence and cling even more tightly to the original conviction. For a biblical literalist, the existence of the Nephilim is a cornerstone of a larger worldview that includes a global flood, a young earth, and a literal Adam and Eve. If one of those cornerstones is proven false, the entire theological structure feels threatened. Therefore, protecting the belief in giants is about much more than just giants. It is about safeguarding a complete and coherent understanding of the world, humanity's place in it, and humanity's relationship with the divine. This is why debunking a specific hoax like the Cardiff Giant has almost no impact on this community. The failure of one piece of evidence is irrelevant because the ultimate source of truth is not the evidence itself, but the scripture that the evidence is meant to confirm. The hoax may be fake, but the biblical truth it points to remains eternal. This faith-based commitment also explains the enduring popularity of figures like the late Ron Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist who claimed to have found numerous biblical artifacts from Noah's Ark to the Pharaoh's chariot wheels in the Red Sea. Among his many assertions was that he had discovered the graves of the Nephilim. While mainstream archaeologists universally dismiss his work as fabrication, he remains a heroic figure to many in literalist circles because he provided the physical correlates they so deeply desire. He offered a bridge between the ancient text and the modern world, making the stories of the Bible feel tangible and immediate. His claims, however outlandish to scientists, fulfill a profound need for empirical affirmation of faith, a need that cold, clinical scientific skepticism cannot and does not seek to meet. The dialogue between these two worlds, religious literalism and scientific skepticism, often resembles two ships passing in the night, speaking different languages and operating on entirely different systems of validation. One seeks to affirm the truth of a revealed sacred text, the other seeks to build knowledge through testable, falsifiable evidence. For one, the discovery of a giant skeleton is a moment of prophecy fulfilled. For the other, it is the beginning of a long and rigorous process of verification. In this fundamental disconnect, we find the core reason why the myth of the ancient giant, for a significant portion of humanity, remains not a myth at all, but a matter of faith, and faith, by its very definition, is evidence of things not seen. This digital ecosystem thrives on a set of principles that actively work against the slow, methodical process of verification. The most powerful of these is the algorithm. Platforms like YouTube and Facebook are not neutral conduits of information. They are engagement engines designed to capture and hold your attention for as long as possible. Their recommendation systems are finely tuned to notice what you linger on. If you watch one video about giant skeletons, the algorithm learns that this topic captures your interest. To keep you on the platform, it will subsequently suggest a cascade of related content. A documentary about the Nephilim, a clip about a strange discovery in Peru, a 3-hour live stream deconstructing the so-called Smithsonian cover-up. Before long, your entire feed becomes a personalized channel dedicated to ancient giants. This creates what is known as a filter bubble, a personalized universe of information where you are rarely, if ever, exposed to contradictory viewpoints or fact-checking content. The algorithm isn't trying to mislead you, it's simply trying to maximize your watch time, but the effect is the same. It builds a digital fortress around a set of beliefs, making them feel not just plausible, but overwhelmingly supported by the sheer volume of content you now consume. Within these algorithmically curated spaces, specific social dynamics take over to reinforce the narrative. Online forums and dedicated Facebook groups become digital campfires where believers gather to share the latest evidence. In these communities, a powerful social feedback loop emerges. When a user posts a new, blurry photograph of a supposed giant bone, they are rewarded with likes, supportive comments, and shares. This positive reinforcement encourages more of the same behavior. Conversely, if someone, even a well-meaning member of the group, posts a link to a scientific debunking or points out the obvious signs of a Photoshop job, they are met with immediate hostility. They are labeled a debunker, a skeptic, or most damningly, a disinformation agent. This social punishment quickly teaches everyone in the group the unspoken rules. Conform to the narrative and you belong, challenge it and you will be exiled. This creates a powerful echo chamber where the only acceptable opinions are those that reaffirm the core belief. Doubt is filtered out not through any top-down censorship, but through the relentless social pressure of the crowd. The community becomes a self-policing entity, fiercely protective of its shared reality. This leads to a fascinating and deeply problematic reinterpretation of authority. In these insulated communities, traditional credentials like a PhD in archaeology or a curatorial position at a major museum are not seen as marks of expertise. In fact, they are often viewed with intense suspicion, framed as proof that the individual is a paid shill for the corrupt mainstream establishment. True authority in this new paradigm is granted to those who best perform the role of the brave outsider. The most influential figures are often charismatic storytellers, independent filmmakers, or self-published authors who position themselves as lone warriors fighting a powerful and shadowy system. Their lack of formal training is not a weakness, it's a badge of honor, proof that they are free from the brainwashing of academia. They speak the language of revelation and conspiracy, not peer review and evidence. When these alternative authorities are challenged with factual counter-evidence, their followers don't see a valid critique. They see an attack from the enemy, which only serves to strengthen their resolve and their faith in the speaker. The very act of debunking is thus absorbed into the conspiracy narrative, becoming yet more proof of how far they will go to hide the truth. The consequence of this entire process is a radical shift in the very nature of what constitutes proof. For the community entrenched in this ecosystem, proof is no longer a physical artifact housed in a museum collection, verified by carbon dating and anatomical analysis. Proof becomes communal and emotional. It is the collective agreement of the group. It is the thrill of connecting dots across different videos and forum posts. It is the emotional satisfaction of feeling that you are part of a small, enlightened group privy to the world's biggest secret. A grainy, unverified photograph from an anonymous source can carry more weight than a peer-reviewed paper in a scientific journal because the photograph feels more true to the community's shared experience. It fits the pattern they have collectively assembled. This is why the relentless debunking of individual hoaxes has so little impact on the overall myth. The community is not built on a foundation of verifiable facts, but on a foundation of shared belief and identity. To abandon the belief in giants would be to abandon the community itself, to lose one's place in this digital tribe of truth seekers. And in an increasingly fragmented world, the sense of belonging and purpose these groups provide is a powerful incentive to keep believing, no matter what the evidence says. Let's step away from the legends and the hoaxes for a moment and conduct a little thought experiment in biomechanics. Suppose we wanted to design a human being not just 7 or 8 feet tall, but a true giant 12, 15, even 20 feet tall. What would that actually take? It's not as simple as just scaling up a blueprint. The laws of physics, particularly a principle known as the square-cube law, become an absolutely brutal and unforgiving architect. This principle states that as you increase an object's dimensions, its surface area increases by the square, but its volume and weight increase by the cube. Let's put that in human terms. Imagine a man who is 6 feet tall and weighs 200 pounds. If we could magically double his height to 12 feet while keeping all his proportions exactly the same, you might think he'd simply weigh twice as much. But that's not how it works. His height has doubled, so his bone length and muscle length have doubled. But his volume, the actual mass of his body, has increased by a factor of 8. That 6-foot man, scaled up to 12 feet, would now weigh not 400 pounds, but a staggering 1,600 pounds. He would be trying to support nearly a ton of weight on a skeleton that is only twice as long and, crucially, only 4 times as strong in its cross-sectional area. His bones would be like twigs trying to hold up a car. They would splinter and shatter under the sheer load of his own body weight the moment he tried to take a step. Now let's push this further and imagine a 20-foot-tall human. The numbers become almost comically impossible. Our 6-foot baseline man, scaled up to 20 feet, would weigh over 14,000 pounds, more than 7 tons. Just standing still would be a Herculean feat, but movement would be a death sentence. Every step would generate colossal impact forces, sending shockwaves through legs that would need to be as thick as tree trunks just to avoid immediate catastrophic failure. And this brings us to the skeleton itself. To withstand such immense forces, the bones couldn't just be longer. They would have to be impossibly thick and dense, completely reshaping the human form into something that would be unrecognizable. The femur or thigh bone would need a diameter so wide that the legs would be like massive pillars, making any kind of graceful movement or running an utter fantasy. The joints, the knees, hips, and ankles would be points of unimaginable stress. The cartilage would be pulverized under the pressure, and the ligaments and tendons, which anchor muscle to bone, would need to be monstrously thick and strong like steel cables just to keep the giant from literally falling apart under its own weight. But the challenges don't stop at the skeleton and muscles. The cardiovascular system would face its own epic struggle. That 14,000-pound giant would need a heart powerful enough to pump blood all the way down to its massive feet and back up against gravity. A human heart is a marvel of engineering, but it's designed for a body of a certain scale. To service a body 20 feet tall, the heart would need to be enormous and generate astronomical blood pressure. This would place the entire circulatory system under immense strain, likely leading to aneurysms, heart failure, or severe fluid retention in the lower extremities. Simply lying down would be dangerous, as the redistribution of blood could overwhelm the heart, and then there's the issue of temperature regulation. Larger bodies generate more internal heat but have a harder time shedding it because their surface area relative to their volume is much smaller. Our 20-foot giant would be a walking furnace, constantly on the brink of fatal heat stroke. It would likely need massive, specialized cooling systems, like enormous ears or skin flaps to radiate heat, features we see in large animals like elephants, which are built very differently from humans for exactly these reasons. This is why the fossil record of truly massive land animals shows us creatures built on a completely different architectural plan than humans. Consider the great sauropod dinosaurs like Argentinosaurus, which could reach lengths of 100 feet and weights of 80 tons or more. They didn't achieve this with a human-like upright posture. They had pillar-like legs directly under their bodies, relatively light but strong vertebrae aided by air sacs, and enormously long necks and tails that helped distribute their mass. They were evolutionary masterpieces of biomechanical engineering, but they were not bipedal and certainly not humanoid. A bipedal, human-shaped creature of even 12 feet is pushing the absolute limits of biological plausibility. When we look at the tallest humans in recorded medical history, like Robert Wadlow, we see the severe health problems that came with his height: the need for leg braces, the lack of sensation in his feet, and the infection that ultimately took his life. His body was already struggling at just under 9 feet tall. A 12-foot human would be an order of magnitude more fragile, a testament not to strength but to the absolute boundaries of our form. So, what does this thought experiment ultimately tell us? It demonstrates that the legendary giants of myth, the 12-foot tall Nephilim or the 15-foot Cyclops, are biomechanical fantasies. They are stories, not biological possibilities. The human body is a beautifully optimized system, and its proportions are the result of millions of years of evolution fine-tuning us for balance, mobility, and endurance on this planet. The square cube law is a physical constraint that no amount of myth-making can overcome. The real giants of our past were not races of towering superhumans. They were, at most, individuals who stood a head or two taller than their peers, their remarkable stature the result of a medical condition that often brought as much suffering as awe. Their legacy is a human one, rooted in the real and poignant limits of our biology, not in the boundless realms of legend. The pattern of deception established by the Cardiff Giant was not confined to American soil. It was a script that would be performed on stages across the globe, each new act adapting the same basic plot to local legends and audience expectations. Take, for instance, the strange and poignant tale of the Irish giant. In the 1700s, a London surgeon and inveterate collector of curiosities named John Hunter became obsessed with acquiring the skeleton of Charles Bryan, a man from Northern Ireland who suffered from gigantism and exhibited himself as a spectacle, standing nearly 7 feet 10 inches tall. Bryan, terrified of ending up on a dissection table, made arrangements to be buried at sea in a lead coffin. But Hunter, driven by an insatiable scientific and personal desire, was not to be deterred. He reportedly bribed the undertaker and intercepted the coffin, boiling the flesh from Bryan's bones in his own home to prepare the skeleton. Today, that very skeleton still stands in the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, a stark and enduring symbol of a different kind of hoax, not one perpetrated on the public, but one of scientific ethics, where the quest for knowledge trampled upon the dignity and final wishes of a human being. Byron's story is a reminder that the exploitation of extraordinary human stature has a long and often grim history, blurring the lines between exhibition, science, and outright theft. Far to the south, the myth-making powers of early exploration created another persistent legend, the Patagonian Giants. The very name Patagonia is thought by some to derive from the Spanish word Patagon, meaning big foot, a moniker given by the explorer Ferdinand Magellan's crew during their historic circumnavigation in the 1520s. The chronicler of the voyage, Antonio Pigafetta, wrote of encountering a race of giants on the southern tip of South America, describing one individual as so tall that we reached only to his waist. These accounts, repeated and embellished by later explorers and mapmakers, cemented the idea of a land of titans in the European imagination for centuries. The reality, however, was a classic case of cross-cultural misunderstanding and perhaps a dash of deliberate exaggeration to enhance the glory of the voyage. The indigenous Tehuelche people of the region were, on average, significantly taller than the Europeans of the era, with some individuals plausibly reaching 6.5 feet or more, a truly imposing figure to a sailor of much shorter stature. Factors like the bulky guanaco hide boots they wore could have contributed to the Bigfoot legend, while their robust build, adapted to a harsh, nomadic life, would have seemed Herculean to the malnourished and weary explorers. The Patagonian Giant was not a hoax in the sense of a carved statue, but a hoax of perception, a legend born from the potent combination of genuine physical difference, the fog of translation, and the irresistible human urge to report wonders from the edge of the known world. Venturing into the Middle East, we find claims deeply entangled with the region's rich religious history, particularly around the ancient city of Hebron in the West Bank. This area is traditionally associated with the biblical story of the Israelite spies who scouted the land of Canaan and reported back to Moses saying, "We saw the Nephilim there. And we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The specific location linked to this account is the Cave of the Patriarchs, believed to be the burial place of biblical figures like Abraham and Sarah. For generations, local tour guides and storytellers have presented visitors with what they claim are the gigantic leg bones of these ancient inhabitants, often identified as the very remains of the giant king Og of Bashan or other Nephilim. These relics are typically nothing more than the fossilized bones of prehistoric animals, such as mammoths or ancient elephants that once roamed the region. The hoax here is one of pious fraud, a well-intentioned but misleading effort to provide physical proof for scripture, leveraging the genuine awe inspired by massive, ancient fossils to strengthen the faith of pilgrims and tourists. It's a powerful demonstration of how a pre-existing belief can dictate the interpretation of physical evidence, turning the femur of a long-extinct beast into a sacred relic of a giant king. When we step back and examine these global hoaxes and misidentifications side by side, a set of common telltale patterns emerges, creating a clear blueprint for deception. The first and most consistent ingredient is the exploitation of local legend. The hoaxer never creates a myth from whole cloth. They simply build a stage for a story the audience is already desperate to believe. In America, it was the mound builder myth and the Nephilim. In Patagonia, it was the European thirst for monstrous races at the world's edge. In the Middle East, it was the deep-seated biblical narrative. The most effective hoax always confirms a pre-existing cultural truth. The second pattern is the reliance on questionable provenance. In virtually every case, the discovery is made not by a recognized scientific body, but by a farmer, a showman, or an anonymous source. The chain of custody is always broken, the context is always vague, and the bones themselves have a mysterious habit of disappearing, being lost by the Smithsonian, or crumbling to dust before they can be independently analyzed. This lack of verifiable origin is not a minor detail. It is the primary shield that protects the hoax from scrutiny. Finally, we see the unmistakable role of a charismatic promoter who stands to benefit. Whether it's George Hull selling tickets, John Hunter seeking a unique specimen for his collection, or a local guide in Hebron earning a few coins from wide-eyed tourists, there is always a human agent with a motive. This promoter understands the power of visual proof, be it a towering gypsum statue, a massive skeleton in a museum case, or an impressive fossil bone presented with a compelling story. They masterfully short-circuit critical thinking by appealing directly to emotion and wonder, making the desire to believe overpower the duty to question. Together, these patterns form a universal playbook for the creation of an archaeological myth. They show us that from the misty coast of Ireland to the windswept plains of Patagonia and the holy lands of the Middle East, the story of the giant skeleton is less about the bones themselves and more about our fears, our faith, and our eternal fascination with a past that feels grander and more mysterious than our own. After exploring the hoaxes, the misidentified fossils, and the powerful psychological reasons we cling to these stories, it would be irresponsible not to pause and ask the most provocative question of all: what if we are wrong? What if, in our diligent effort to debunk the myths and explain away the anomalies, mainstream science has actually missed a profound and genuine chapter in the human story? This isn't about giving credence to every blurry photograph or sensational tabloid headline, but about honestly examining the nature of scientific knowledge itself and asking what it would genuinely take to rewrite the textbooks. The first thing to understand is that science is not a collection of immutable facts carved in stone. It is a process, a continuous, self-correcting method of inquiry that is always, by its very nature, provisional. The entire history of science is a story of paradigm shifts, where long-held beliefs were overturned by new evidence. There was a time when the medical establishment ridiculed the idea that doctors should wash their hands between patients, when geologists scoffed at the theory of plate tectonics, and when the concept of a meteorite falling from space was considered superstitious nonsense. The current scientific consensus that there was no race of ancient giants is based on the evidence available today. But if compelling, verifiable evidence to the contrary were to emerge, that consensus would have to change. That is the strength of the scientific method, not its weakness. It is built not on faith, but on a willingness to follow the data, no matter how surprising the destination. So, what would that kind of game-changing evidence actually look like? It certainly wouldn't be a single, isolated skeleton, no matter how large. A single anomalous find can always be explained as a pathological condition, a statistical outlier, or even an elaborate one-off hoax. To truly convince the scientific community, the evidence would need to be overwhelming and repeatable. Imagine, for a moment, the discovery of an entire burial ground, meticulously excavated by a team of accredited archaeologists following every modern protocol. In this hypothetical site, they wouldn't find just one or two large skeletons, but dozens, perhaps even hundreds, all displaying the same extraordinary proportions. The context would be crucial. These skeletons would be found with their own distinct toolkit artifacts, weapons, and pottery scaled to their size, showing a coherent culture that couldn't be explained as just a group of isolated individuals with gigantism. The stratigraphy, the layers of soil in which they were buried, would place them firmly in a specific ancient time period, and that dating would be confirmed by multiple independent methods. Radiocarbon dating of the bones, thermoluminescence dating of the associated pottery, and perhaps even volcanic ash layers above and below the site would all tell the same story. This was a population that lived and died together in a specific epoch. The most compelling proof would come from the bones themselves, subjected to the full battery of modern laboratory analysis. Paleogeneticists would successfully extract DNA from multiple individuals, and that DNA would reveal a startling story. It wouldn't show the known genetic markers for pituitary gigantism. Instead, it would reveal a unique and consistent genetic signature, distinguishing this group not as medically anomalous humans, but as a distinct hominin species or a profoundly different subspecies of Homo sapiens. The biomechanical analysis would be just as critical. The structure of the hip joints, the curvature of the spine, and the thickness of the long bones would all need to demonstrate an anatomy that was not merely a scaled-up version of ours, but one that was viably adapted for their size. They would need to show biomechanical efficiency, not the pathological stress markers we see in individuals with gigantism. This would prove that we aren't looking at a disease, but at a stable, naturally occurring form. Furthermore, stable isotope analysis of their teeth and bones would paint a picture of a unique diet and a specific geographic range, suggesting they were a thriving population, not a collection of ailing individuals. This entire body of evidence, contextual, cultural, genetic, and anatomical, would then need to be published in a top-tier, peer-reviewed journal like Nature or Science, where it would be scrutinized and criticized by the sharpest minds in the field. Other teams of researchers would need to be able to visit the site, examine the findings, and ultimately replicate the discovery with finds of their own in different parts of the world. Only after this grueling process of verification and replication would the scientific community slowly, and perhaps reluctantly, begin to accept that our understanding of the human past was fundamentally incomplete. This thought experiment reveals the immense evidential burden that any claim of a lost race of giants would have to overcome. It's not that scientists are closed-minded or part of a conspiracy. It's that the claim is so extraordinary that it demands an extraordinary standard of proof. The history of this topic is so polluted with hoaxes, misidentifications, and pseudoscience that the burden of proof is justifiably set astronomically high. A grainy photo or a century-old newspaper article will never meet that standard. The true path to discovering a real mystery doesn't lie in bypassing scientific institutions, but in engaging with them at the highest level of rigor and integrity. The enduring allure of the giant myth, therefore, lies in this tantalizing what if. It's the possibility that somewhere buried deep beneath the earth lies a discovery so profound that it would force us to reimagine our entire history. And until that day comes, if it ever does, the legend persists in that shadowy space between the known and the unknown, a permanent reminder that the final chapters of the human story have not yet all been written. So after this long and winding journey through mounds, museums, and medical journals, where does the evidence truly lead us? The inescapable conclusion is that the case for an ancient race of giant humans doesn't just have a few holes in it. Its entire foundation is built on sand, a shifting mixture of deliberate hoaxes, honest misunderstandings, and the powerful, enduring echo of our oldest stories. From George Hull's gypsum creation to the photoshopped fabrications of the digital age, the trail of proof is littered with human deception. From the mammoth bones mistaken for cyclops skulls to the mastodon molars presented as giants' teeth, the record is filled with the confusion that arises when we interpret the unfamiliar through the lens of our existing myths. And from the biblical Nephilim to the Paiute Sea Tikar, the global tapestry of giant lore speaks not to a shared history of literal titans, but to a shared human psychology, a deep-seated need to populate our past with beings of immense power and mystery. While science has uncovered tall individuals, victims of the medical tragedy of gigantism who would have been awe-inspiring in their time, it has never once uncovered a single, verifiable skeleton of a healthy, 12-foot human, nor a single artifact from a coherent culture of such beings. The verdict, when you weigh all the evidence, is clear. The giants we seek are not buried in the earth, but are immortal residents of the landscape of our imagination. This entire investigation serves as a powerful masterclass in the importance of critical thinking. It teaches us to be wary of the single, blurry photograph presented without context, to question the charismatic storyteller who claims that every expert is part of a conspiracy, and to understand that our own desire for a story to be true can be the biggest obstacle to seeing the truth. The next time you encounter a claim that seems to overturn everything we know, arm yourself with a few simple tools. Ask about the source, who is providing this information, and what might they have to gain. Look for the evidence. Can it be independently verified, or does it mysteriously disappear when scientists ask to examine it? And most importantly, apply the principle championed by Carl Sagan, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The idea of a lost race of giants is about as extraordinary as it gets, and the evidence offered has consistently been anything but. By embracing this skeptical mindset, you don't become a cynic, you become a guardian of reality, protecting your own curiosity from those who would exploit it with forgeries and fairy tales. You learn to find a deeper, more genuine wonder in the actual mysteries of our past, which are astounding enough without needing to be inflated into myth. The human story is magnificent precisely because it is real. The true saga of our species, of how we migrated out of Africa, painted breathtaking art on cave walls, domesticated plants and animals, built the pyramids and reached for the stars, is packed with more drama, ingenuity, and sheer epic scale than any fantasy. Our quest for knowledge shouldn't be about chasing phantom giants, but about illuminating the genuine, breathtaking achievements of our ancestors. The real treasures of history aren't hidden in secret vaults. They're in our museums, our libraries, and the ongoing work of archaeologists and historians who piece together our collective past, fragment by painstaking fragment. This doesn't make the past any less magical, it makes it more meaningful. It connects us to real people who loved, struggled, created, and wondered about the world just as we do. By letting go of the seductive fiction of giants, we don't lose a sense of wonder. We open ourselves up to a richer, more profound appreciation for the intricate and incredible truth of the human journey. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most persistent mysteries and you're hungry for more investigations that separate fact from folklore, then please consider subscribing to the channel. We're dedicated to unraveling the world's greatest enigmas, from lost cities to archaeological controversies, always guided by evidence and a respect for the fascinating complexity of the truth. Your support helps us continue this work and bring these stories to light, and now we'd love to hear from you. After all this, what ancient mystery captures your imagination the most? Is there a legendary city, a cryptic artifact, or an unsolved historical puzzle that you find endlessly compelling? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation about our incredible past going.